The marble floors of First Capital Trust echoed with the confident clicks of designer heels and polished Oxfords as the morning crowd of financial professionals streamed through the grand entrance. Among them was Harold Jenkins, his weathered hands gripping a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days, much like the faded plaid shirt and simple khaki pants he wore. At 72, Harold moved with the unhurried pace of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere particular to be, a stark contrast to the hurried energy around him. The lobby sparkled with opulence, crystal chandeliers, mahogany desks, and tellers positioned behind gleaming counters. Harold shuffled toward the customer service area, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with quiet appreciation. He'd seen the building change over decades, watched as old wood gave way to marble, as simple glass was replaced with ornate fixtures. Progress, they called it. Harold had his own thoughts on that. Behind the premium customer service desk sat Melissa Winters, 28, with perfectly manicured nails and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Harold as he approached, then immediately back to her computer screen. "Good morning," Harold said, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age but still strong with dignity. Melissa didn't look up. "Regular customers need to use the main teller line," she said, gesturing vaguely to the right where a considerable queue had formed. Harold smiled patiently. "I have an appointment with Marcus Reynolds at 10. Could you let him know I'm here?" This time Melissa did look up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Harold's appearance, from his scuffed work boots to the frayed collar of his shirt. "You have an appointment with the branch manager?" The skepticism in her voice was thinly veiled. "That's right," Harold replied simply. Melissa's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched higher. "And your name is?" "Harold Jenkins." She made a show of checking her computer, her long nails clicking against the keyboard. "I don't see any appointment for a Harold Jenkins." Harold's smile didn't waver. "Perhaps you could call Mr. Reynolds directly? He'll know." A flash of annoyance crossed Melissa's face. "Sir, Mr. Reynolds is extremely busy today. If you don't have a scheduled appointment, I'd be happy to help you with whatever basic services you need." She emphasized the word basic just enough to make her meaning clear. From the adjacent desk, another customer service representative named Blake Thompson glanced over. Blake was in his early 30s, ambitious, and always dressed impeccably in tailored suits that cost more than he could comfortably afford. He had been eavesdropping on the conversation, and now seized what he saw as an opportunity to rescue his colleague. "I can help you over here, sir," Blake called out, his voice carrying a practiced customer service lilt that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We have some wonderful basic checking accounts that might suit your needs." Harold turned slowly, taking in Blake's expensive suit and the condescending smile that accompanied his offer. "That's kind of you, but I'm not here for a new account." Blake's smile tightened. "Well, whatever you need. I'm sure we can help you without troubling Mr. Reynolds. Perhaps you're interested in our senior services." By now, several customers nearby had begun to take notice of the exchange. Among them was Catherine Yates, the regional director who happened to be visiting the branch that day. She stood near the entrance, observing the interaction with growing interest. Harold remained composed, though something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening of his spine, a slight lift of his chin. "Young man, I appreciate your eagerness, but I do need to speak with Marcus. It's regarding some significant decisions about this branch." Blake exchanged a glance with Melissa, both of them barely containing their amusement. "Significant decisions?" Blake repeated, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Sir, perhaps there's been some confusion. Mr. Reynolds oversees major accounts and investment portfolios." Harold nodded. "I'm aware of what Marcus does." A few customers in line had begun to whisper among themselves, some with embarrassment, others with the uncomfortable fascination of witnessing something inappropriate unfold. Melissa, perhaps sensing the attention they were attracting, decided to end the situation. "I'll call Mr. Reynolds' office," she said with exaggerated patience. "But I should warn you, he typically only meets with our premium clients." As she reached for the phone, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open, and Marcus Reynolds himself emerged. At 45, Marcus had the confident bearing of someone who had climbed steadily through the ranks of banking. He scanned the lobby as he walked, his expression shifting from professional detachment to genuine warmth when he spotted Harold. "Mr. Jenkins," he called out, striding across the marble floor. "I thought we said 10 o'clock. I was just coming down to check if I'd missed you." Before Harold could respond, Marcus had reached him, extending his hand with unmistakable respect. "Always a pleasure to see you, sir. I have everything ready in my office." Melissa froze, her hand still on the phone. Blake's smug expression faltered. "Marcus," Harold greeted warmly, shaking the manager's hand. "Right on time, actually. Your staff was just explaining to me that I might be confused about our appointment." Something flickered across Marcus's face, understanding, then concern. He glanced at Melissa and Blake, who both suddenly found great interest in their computer screens. "I see," he said carefully. "Well, there's obviously been a misunderstanding. Mr. Jenkins, if you'll follow me upstairs, we shouldn't keep the others waiting." As Harold moved to follow Marcus, Catherine Yates stepped forward, introducing herself with a hand extended toward Harold. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Catherine Yates, the regional director. It's an honor to finally meet you. I hope you haven't been waiting long." Harold's weathered hand clasped hers firmly. "Not at all, Ms. Yates. I was just getting acquainted with your customer service team." Catherine's smile remained fixed, but her eyes darted toward Melissa and Blake. "I hope they were demonstrating our commitment to exceptional service." "They were certainly demonstrating something," Harold replied, his tone mild but his meaning clear. Blake's face had gone pale, a slow realization dawning as he watched the regional director and branch manager treat this simply dressed old man with such deference. Melissa was frantically typing something into her computer, likely searching for whatever information she should have known. As Marcus guided Harold toward the elevator, a young teller named Zoe Wilson approached, carrying a tray with a cup of coffee. "Your usual, Mr. Jenkins," she said with a genuine smile. "Black with just a touch of honey." Harold's face brightened. "Thank you, Zoe. How's your grandmother doing with that new treatment we discussed?" "Much better, sir. Those specialists you recommended made all the difference. She asks about you every time I visit." Harold nodded, pleased. "Tell her I'm still waiting for that chess rematch. She won't get lucky twice." Zoe laughed, the sound natural and warm compared to the strained atmosphere around them. "I'll tell her, though she'll say it was skill, not luck." As Harold, Marcus, and Catherine moved toward the elevator, the whispers in the lobby grew. Customers who had been watching now turned to each other in confusion and curiosity. Who was this unassuming old man in work clothes who commanded such respect from the bank's leadership? Inside the elevator, Catherine turned to Harold with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Jenkins, if any of our staff was less than respectful—" Harold raised a hand, gently cutting her off. "No need to worry about that now. We have more important matters to discuss. Besides," he added with a slight twinkle in his eye, "it's not the first time, and at my age, you develop a certain perspective on these things." Marcus looked uncomfortable nonetheless. "Still, it's unacceptable. I'll address it personally after our meeting." Harold just shook his head slightly as the elevator climbed to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a hallway of executive offices and a large conference room where several people in expensive suits were already seated around a polished table. They rose as Harold entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, "for those who haven't had the pleasure, this is Harold Jenkins." A distinguished-looking woman in her 60s stepped forward. "The legendary Harold Jenkins. I've heard so much about you. I'm Victoria Hargrove, head of East Coast Operations." Harold shook her hand warmly. "The pleasure is mine, Ms. Hargrove. Your reputation precedes you as well." As introductions continued around the table, Harold took his place at the head chair, not with arrogance but with the natural ease of someone sitting where they belonged. He placed his worn briefcase on the table and carefully removed several folders. Back downstairs, Blake had pulled Melissa aside, his voice urgent and low. "Do you have any idea who that was?" Melissa shook her head, still scanning through the bank's client database. "Some VIP client? I can't find anything on him except a basic checking account opened 50 years ago." Blake ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. "I overheard Catherine Yates talking to her assistant. That's Harold Jenkins." "So? Who is Harold Jenkins?" Blake looked at her like she'd asked who the president was. "Harold Jenkins. The Harold Jenkins. He owns this bank. Not just this branch, the entire First Capital Trust network, all $27 billion of it." Melissa's face drained of color. That's not possible. He looks like my grandfather on his way to Home Depot." "Well, your grandfather doesn't own one of the largest independent banks in the country," Blake hissed. "We just condescended to the man who signs our paychecks." Zoe, the young teller, passed by with the empty coffee tray and caught the tail end of their conversation. "Mr. Jenkins comes in about once a month," she said. "Always dresses the same. Never makes a big deal about who he is. He remembers everyone's name if you've met him even once." "Why doesn't he dress like, you know?" Melissa gestured vaguely upward, indicating the executive floor. Zoe shrugged. "Maybe when you have $27 billion, you don't need to prove anything to anyone." In the conference room upstairs, Harold was reviewing the quarterly performance reports. Despite his unassuming appearance, his questions were incisive, demonstrating a razor-sharp understanding of the business. The assembled executives responded with the attentiveness reserved for someone whose word could make or break careers. "These community investment numbers are lower than we discussed," Harold noted, tapping a section of the report. "What happened to the small business initiative in the West Side neighborhood?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "The committee felt the risk assessment didn't justify the capital allocation, given the economic profile of that area." Harold looked up, his gaze steady. "The committee felt that way, did they? The same committee that approved 3 new branches in affluent suburbs last quarter?" The room fell silent. Harold closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. "Let me remind everyone of something. This bank exists today because 50 years ago, when I was trying to start my construction business, exactly one loan officer in this city was willing to take a chance on a young black man with big dreams and empty pockets." He paused, looking around the table. "We don't just evaluate spreadsheets here. We evaluate potential. And sometimes potential wears work boots instead of wingtips." Victoria Hargrove nodded slowly, a smile of appreciation spreading across her face. She had heard stories about Harold Jenkins, about his principles and his unexpected approach to leadership. But seeing it in person was something else entirely. "So," Harold continued, "I want the West Side Initiative back on the table, not as charity, I don't believe in handouts, but as sound business. Those neighborhoods have entrepreneurs with ideas just as valuable as anywhere else. They just need the capital to make them real." Catherine Yates was already making notes. "I'll personally oversee a restructuring of the risk assessment metrics, Mr. Jenkins. We'll have a new proposal by the end of the week." Harold's eyes crinkled at the corners. "That's what I like to hear, Ms. Yates. Now let's talk about this new digital banking platform. The adoption rates in our lower income branches are concerning me." For the next hour, Harold led the meeting with the confident ease of someone who had built something from nothing and understood every moving part. He asked pointed questions, challenged assumptions, and occasionally shared insights from his 5 decades in business. The executives, many with Ivy League MBAs and decades in banking themselves, listened with rapt attention. What none of them knew was that Harold had been watching Melissa and Blake from the moment he entered the bank. Their behavior hadn't surprised him. It was a story as old as time itself, but he made mental notes nonetheless. Not for retribution, but for education. As the meeting wound down, Harold closed his folder and addressed the room. Before we finish, I want to discuss something that happened downstairs today. The executives exchanged glances, sensing a shift in tone. 2 of your customer service representatives made assumptions about me based on my appearance, Harold said matter-of-factly. Now, I'm not here to get anyone fired. That's not how I operate. But I am concerned about what this says about our culture. Marcus started to apologize again, but Harold raised his hand gently. Let me finish, Marcus. This isn't about me. I've dealt with much worse than a condescending tone from someone young enough to be my grandchild. He chuckled softly. The issue is what this means for our customers. If your staff makes snap judgments about me, the owner of this institution, what judgments are they making about the single mother trying to open her first checking account? Or the immigrant family saving for their first home? Or the young man from the wrong side of town with a brilliant business idea? The room fell silent, the truth of his words sinking in. Harold continued, his voice measured but firm. Banking isn't just about money. It's about trust and opportunity. When I started my construction company with that first loan, the banker who approved it told me something I never forgot. He said, "Mr. Jenkins, I'm not investing in your collateral. I'm investing in your character." That philosophy built this bank. Harold stood, gathering his briefcase. I don't want those 2 young people downstairs punished. I want them educated, not with some corporate diversity seminar, but with real understanding. Can I leave that in your hands, Marcus? Marcus nodded solemnly. Absolutely, Mr. Jenkins. I have some ideas already. Good man, Harold said with a nod. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lunch date with my granddaughter. She just made partner at her law firm, and I promised her the biggest stake in town. As the meeting dispersed, Victoria Hargrove fell in step beside Harold as they walked toward the elevator. That was impressive, she said quietly. Most people in your position would have demanded those employees be fired on the spot. Harold shook his head. Firing people doesn't teach them anything except fear, and fear never built anything worth having. He paused before adding, Besides, I wasn't always the owner of this bank. I remember what it feels like to be judged by your cover rather than your contents. Downstairs, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Word had spread throughout the branch about the identity of the unassuming elderly man in the worn clothes. Melissa sat at her desk, her face still pale, her usual confidence replaced by dread. Blake paced nearby, tugging at his collar as if it had suddenly tightened around his neck. What do you think will happen? Melissa whispered when Blake passed her desk again. Best case, we get transferred to some branch in the middle of nowhere. Worst case, we're clearing out our desks by lunch, Blake replied, his voice strained. Zoe, who was counting her drawer nearby, shook her head slightly but said nothing. She had tried to tell them months ago when she first started working there about the importance of treating every customer with respect. They had laughed at her idealism. When the elevator doors opened and Harold emerged with the executive team, a hush fell over the lobby. Customers and employees alike watched as the group crossed the marble floor. Harold walked with the same unhurried pace as before, but now everyone saw him differently. Not as an old man in work clothes, but as a power broker disguised as an everyday person. Marcus caught Blake's eye and motioned for him and Melissa to approach. They exchanged terrified glances before walking over, their steps heavy with dread. "Mr. Jenkins," Marcus said formally, "these are the customer service representatives you met earlier, Blake Thompson and Melissa Winters." Harold looked at them thoughtfully, taking in their nervous expressions. "Good to properly meet you both," he said, extending his hand. They each shook it, mumbling apologies that Harold waved away. "No need for that now. Instead, I have a proposition for you both." Blake and Melissa straightened, bracing themselves. "Marcus is going to arrange for you to spend the next month rotating through our community branches in Westside, Riverdale, and East Point," Harold explained. "You'll work directly with customers from all walks of life, not behind a desk, but face to face. You'll hear their stories, understand their needs, and most importantly, learn to see beyond appearances." It wasn't a punishment, not exactly, but it was certainly not what they had expected. The community branches were in working-class neighborhoods far from the prestigious downtown location. They were smaller, busier, and served a far more diverse clientele. "After that month," Harold continued, "you'll come back here with new perspectives that will make you better at your jobs. Or," he added with a slight smile, "you might discover you prefer those branches. Many of our best managers started that way." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I'll work out the details this afternoon. You'll start next Monday." Before either could respond, Harold turned to address the wider group of employees who had gathered nearby, watching the exchange. "Let me tell you all something my father taught me," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby. He was a janitor who cleaned office buildings at night, including banks like this one. He used to say, "Harold, the man in the $1,000 suit and the woman in worn-out shoes both have to walk the same ground. Remember that when you're serving our customers." With that, Harold shook Marcus's hand once more and headed for the exit. As he reached the door, Zoe called out, "Enjoy lunch with your granddaughter, Mr. Jenkins." Harold turned, his face lighting up. "Thank you, Zoe. I'm sure Diana will talk my ear off about contract law the whole time, but that's the price of having brilliant grandchildren." With a final wave, he was gone, leaving behind a lobby full of people with much to think about. Outside, Harold walked 3 blocks to where his car was parked, not in the bank's executive garage, but in a public lot. It wasn't a luxury vehicle, but a sensible 5-year-old sedan, clean and well-maintained. As he slid behind the wheel, he allowed himself a small sigh. These visits always left him with mixed emotions, pride in what he had built, certainly, but also a weariness from constantly having to prove his worth all over again. He checked his watch, still plenty of time before meeting Diana for lunch. On impulse, he started the car and drove toward the old neighborhood where everything had begun. 20 minutes later, Harold parked in front of a small construction office with Jenkins Building and Development on the sign. Though he had diversified his business interests decades ago, this modest office remained the headquarters of his original company. He had never seen a reason to move to some glass tower downtown. As he walked in, the receptionist looked up and beamed. "Mr. J, we weren't expecting you today." "Just in the neighborhood, Tanya," Harold replied warmly. "Is Michael around?" "In his office," she said, gesturing down the hall. "Want me to buzz him?" "No need to disturb him. I'll just poke my head in." Harold walked through the familiar corridor, passing walls lined with photos showing 5 decades of projects, from small residential renovations to major commercial developments. Each represented not just a building, but lives changed, communities improved, and opportunities created. Michael Jenkins, Harold's son and the company's current president, looked up in surprise when his office door opened. At 51, Michael had his father's steady gaze and thoughtful demeanor, though he dressed more conventionally in business casual attire. "Dad, I thought you had the bank meeting today," Michael said, standing to embrace his father. Just finished, Harold replied, settling into the chair across from his son's desk. Thought I'd stop by before meeting Diana for lunch. Michael studied his father's face. And how did it go? Did they give you any trouble about the West Side Initiative? Harold smiled slightly. Nothing I couldn't handle. We're back on track. He glanced around the office, taking in the blueprints spread across the desk. What's this you're working on? Michael's eyes lit up as he turned the plans toward his father. The community center project. We just got approval for the expanded design, including the job training facilities you suggested. Harold leaned forward, examining the blueprints with practiced eyes. Despite his success in banking and other ventures, construction remained his first love. He ran his weathered finger along the outline of the building. Good sight lines, he commented. And I like how you've oriented the main entrance toward the park. People will feel welcomed. They discussed the project for several minutes, with Harold offering occasional suggestions that Michael noted carefully. Though he had officially handed over the company reins years ago, Harold's insights were still valued. Eventually, Harold glanced at his watch again. I should get going. Diana will be waiting. As they walked to the door, Michael hesitated. Dad, you know you could make things easier on yourself. When you go to these bank meetings, you could at least dress the part. Harold finished for him, a hint of amusement in his voice. Michael shrugged. I'm just saying, maybe it would save you from these situations if you looked more like what they expect. Harold placed a hand on his son's shoulder. And deny myself the pleasure of seeing their faces when they realize their mistake? Never. His expression turned more serious. Besides, I never want to forget where I came from, Michael. These clothes remind me, and them, that worth isn't measured by appearance. Michael nodded, understanding. It was an old conversation between them, one that reflected their different approaches to the world. Michael had grown up with privilege his father never had, and sometimes struggled to fully grasp Harold's perspective. Tell Diana I'm proud of her, Michael said as they reached the door. Though I'm sure you'll say it enough for both of us. Harold smiled. That I will, and bring the family over on Sunday. Your mother's making her famous pot roast. Back in his car, Harold sat for a moment before starting the engine. The morning's events replayed in his mind, not just the condescension from Blake and Melissa, but the executive meeting as well. He thought about the West Side Initiative, about the families and businesses that would benefit, about the cycle of opportunity that had allowed his own success to grow and multiply. As he pulled into traffic, Harold's mind drifted back 50 years, to when he was just a young man with dreams bigger than his bank account. Back then, he couldn't have imagined owning a bank. He had just wanted to build houses, to create something tangible and lasting. The banking empire had come later, almost by accident, a series of investments and opportunities that snowballed over decades. The restaurant Harold chose for lunch with Diana wasn't the kind of upscale establishment one might expect from a billionaire banker. Giovanni's was a family-owned Italian place in a modest neighborhood, with red checkered tablecloths and photos of Rome on the walls. It had been there for almost as long as Harold had been in business, and the owner, Giovanni himself, was one of Harold's first clients. Harold arrived a few minutes early and was immediately enveloped in a bear hug by the elderly Italian man, who spotted him from across the room. "Harold, my old friend," Giovanni exclaimed, patting Harold's back enthusiastically. "It's been too long since you graced my humble establishment." Harold chuckled, returning the embrace. 2 weeks is hardly too long, Giovanni, and there's nothing humble about your cooking." Giovanni led him to his usual corner table, chatting animatedly about his grandchildren and the new wine he'd imported from his cousin's vineyard in Tuscany. Like Harold, Giovanni had built his business from nothing, starting with a small deli counter and gradually expanding into the beloved restaurant it was today. Your usual table, my friend. The best in the house for the man who gave me my first loan when the bank said no. It was a story Giovanni loved to tell, though Harold always deflected the credit. When the young Italian immigrant had been turned down by 3 banks, Harold, then just starting to find success with his construction company, had lent him the money to open his restaurant. It wasn't charity. Harold had seen potential in Giovanni's incredible cooking and work ethic. The loan had been repaid within 2 years, and their friendship had lasted 5 decades. Diana will be joining me today, Harold told him. She just made partner at her law firm. Giovanni's face lit up. Ah, the brilliant granddaughter. We must celebrate. I will prepare something special. Before Harold could respond, the door opened and Diana Jenkins walked in. At 32, she was a striking woman with her grandmother's elegant features and her grandfather's determined eyes. Unlike Harold, she was dressed in a way that announced her professional success: a tailored pantsuit, subtle jewelry, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to commanding a room. Her serious expression melted into a warm smile when she spotted her grandfather. She crossed the restaurant quickly, leaning down to embrace him. "Grandpa," she said, her voice soft with affection. "Sorry if I'm late. Court ran over." "Not late at all," Harold assured her, studying her face with pride. "You look tired, though. They working you too hard already?" Diana laughed as she took her seat. "Says the man who still works 60-hour weeks at 72. I'm fine, Grandpa. It's the good kind of tired." Giovanni approached with 2 glasses of sparkling water and a knowing smile. "Signorina Diana, congratulations on becoming partner. Your grandfather told me the good news." "Thank you, Giovanni," Diana replied warmly. "And whatever you're cooking back there smells amazing." "For you, only the best," Giovanni declared before heading back to the kitchen, already calling out instructions to his staff. Once they were alone, Diana studied her grandfather with the keen eye she'd inherited from him. "You had the quarterly meeting at the bank today. How did that go?" Harold took a sip of his water. "Productive. We're moving forward with the West Side Initiative." Diana nodded, clearly pleased. "Good. That neighborhood needs the investment." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "But something else happened. I can tell." Harold chuckled. "Can't hide anything from you, can I? Just a little misunderstanding when I first arrived. Nothing important." "Grandpa," Diana said, her tone making it clear she wasn't accepting that answer. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Harold sighed, then recounted the incident with Blake and Melissa. As he spoke, Diana's expression darkened, her fingers tightening around her water glass. "They should be fired," she said when he finished, her voice carrying the same quiet intensity Harold used when he was truly angry. "That kind of behavior is completely unacceptable." Harold shook his head. "That's not how I handle things, Diana. You know that. Instead, you're sending them to the community branches for education," Diana said, making air quotes with her fingers. "Grandpa, you're too forgiving sometimes. People like that don't change." "You don't know that," Harold replied gently. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, including those 2. Diana leaned back in her chair, studying him with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "I don't know how you do it. After everything you've been through, all the times people have underestimated you or treated you like you were nothing, how do you not get angry?" Harold's eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing beyond the restaurant to some private memory. "Who says I don't get angry? I feel it just like anyone else, but I learned a long time ago that anger is like holding a hot coal in your hand, intending to throw it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned." Diana's expression softened. "Buddha said that, not you." Harold grinned. "Maybe we both had the same idea." Their conversation paused as Giovanni's daughter brought out their appetizers: calamari for Diana and bruschetta for Harold, both prepared exactly the way they preferred. As they began to eat, Diana returned to the subject. "It just bothers me that even now, after all you've accomplished, people still see an old black man in simple clothes and make assumptions." "And what would you have me do?" Harold asked. "Wear custom suits and diamond cufflinks? Drive a Bentley? That's not who I am." "I know, Grandpa. I'm not saying you should change. I just wish the world would." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "It is changing, Diana. Slowly, yes, but changing nonetheless. When I started out, I couldn't even get a meeting with most banks, let alone own one. Now you're partner at a law firm that wouldn't have hired you as a secretary back then." Diana acknowledged this with a slight nod, though her expression remained troubled. "But we still have so far to go. That's why your work is so important," Harold said. "Those pro bono cases you take, the community legal clinics you run, they matter. Maybe more than my banking decisions." Diana shook her head, embarrassed by the praise. "I learned from the best. You and Dad and Grandma. You all taught me that success means nothing if you don't use it to help others." Their main courses arrived, osso buco for Harold and seafood linguine for Diana, and they spent a few moments appreciating the food before continuing their conversation. "How is your mother?" Harold asked eventually. "I haven't spoken to her this week." Diana's parents had divorced when she was 12, and though the split had been amicable, her mother had moved to Chicago for her career as a pediatric surgeon. Diana's expression warmed at the mention of her mother. "She's good. Busy with a new research project on childhood asthma treatments. She asked about you too." Harold nodded, pleased. Despite their divorce, he maintained a respectful relationship with his former daughter-in-law. "Tell her I'm still breathing and still annoying the board members. That should make her laugh." As they ate, their conversation drifted to Diana's work, Harold's other business interests, and family matters. Like her grandfather, Diana had a sharp mind for details and a passion for justice, though she expressed it through legal channels rather than business ones. "The Thompson case goes to trial next month," she told him, referring to a pro bono case she'd been working on for nearly a year. "Families being evicted by a landlord who wants to convert their building to luxury condos. The paperwork is technically legal, but the methods have been borderline harassment." Harold listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed his thorough understanding of both real estate law and the neighborhood in question. When Diana mentioned the name of the development company, his eyebrows rose slightly. "Platinum Properties," he repeated. "Their CEO is Lawrence Morgan, isn't he?" Diana nodded. "You know him?" "We've crossed paths," Harold said, his tone neutral. "He's tried to get financing from First Capital Trust several times over the years." "And?" Diana prompted, sensing there was more to the story. Harold's expression hardened slightly. "And we declined. Morgan's business practices don't align with our values." Diana smiled. "Meaning he's a shark who doesn't care who gets hurt as long as he makes a profit." "Your words, not mine," Harold replied, though his slight smile confirmed her assessment. "But if you're going up against Platinum, be careful. Morgan doesn't like to lose." "Neither do I," Diana said with determination, "especially not when my clients are a family with 3 children and nowhere else to go." Harold studied his granddaughter with quiet pride. In many ways, she reminded him of himself at a younger age. The same tenacity, the same commitment to fighting for what was right. But she had advantages he never had, doors that had been opened because of his hard work. That was exactly as he had intended. As they finished their main courses, Giovanni appeared with a special dessert, a tiramisu with "Congratulations, Diana," written in chocolate across the plate. "On the house," he insisted when Harold reached for his wallet. For the newest partner he turned to Diana. "Which firm is it again?" "Bradford, Wells and Schmidt," Diana supplied. Giovanni's eyes widened. The big one downtown with all the glass windows, Mamma Mia, so prestigious. After they had thanked Giovanni profusely and finished their dessert, Harold and Diana walked out to the street together. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces as they stood beside Diana's sleek silver car, a practical luxury vehicle that reflected her personality perfectly. "Thanks for lunch, Grandpa," Diana said, embracing him again, "and for always being my biggest supporter." Harold held her tight for a moment. "I'm proud of you, Diana, not just for making partner, but for the kind of lawyer you've chosen to be. Your grandmother would have been so proud too." At the mention of her grandmother, Diana's eyes grew misty. Margaret Jenkins had passed away 3 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer, leaving a void in all their lives. She had been Harold's partner in every sense, supporting his dreams, challenging his thinking, and keeping him grounded through both success and failure. "I miss her," Diana said simply. "Every day," Harold agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "But she lives on in you, in Michael, in all of us who carry her lessons forward." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their memories of Margaret. She had been the family's moral compass, the one who ensured that their growing wealth never corrupted their values. "Will you come to dinner on Sunday?" Harold asked eventually. "Your father and his family will be there." "I wouldn't miss it," Diana promised. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Harold said. "And maybe that strawberry cake your grandmother loved so much if you have time to bake it." Diana smiled. "I'll make time." After one more embrace, Diana got into her car, and Harold watched her drive away, his heart full of pride and love. Of all his accomplishments, the buildings he'd constructed, the bank he'd acquired, the wealth he'd accumulated, nothing meant more to him than his family. He walked to his own car, his mind turning back to the morning's events at the bank. Diana's reaction to Blake and Melissa's behavior had been predictable: righteous anger on his behalf, a desire for consequences. It was the same reaction Michael would have had, the same response most people would consider appropriate. But Harold had learned long ago that public humiliation rarely led to genuine change. Those 2 young bank employees didn't need to be punished, they needed to understand. The assignments to the community branches weren't about embarrassing them, but about expanding their worldview. As he drove toward home, Harold's thoughts drifted to Lawrence Morgan and Platinum Properties. The fact that Diana was going up against Morgan's company troubled him slightly, not because he doubted her abilities, but because he knew firsthand how ruthless Morgan could be. Perhaps it was time to review those loan applications Morgan had submitted over the years, to refresh his memory on exactly what kind of man his granddaughter was facing in court. Harold's home was neither a mansion nor a penthouse, but a well-maintained colonial in a historic neighborhood he had helped revitalize decades ago. The 2-story brick house with its wide front porch and mature oak trees had been his and Margaret's home for 45 years. They had purchased it when the neighborhood was in decline, when most of their friends thought they were crazy to invest there. But Harold had seen potential where others saw problems, a skill that had served him well throughout his career. Under his guidance, the Jenkins Construction Company had renovated dozens of homes in the area, installing modern amenities while preserving the neighborhood's historic character. Now, it was one of the most desirable addresses in the city, though Harold took care to ensure that affordable housing remained available for long-time residents. As he pulled into his driveway, Harold noticed his neighbor, Mrs. Gladys Patterson, struggling with her garbage cans. At 86, she was one of the few neighbors who had been there even longer than Harold. Without hesitation, he parked his car and walked over to help. "Afternoon, Gladys," he called as he approached. "Let me get those for you." The elderly woman looked up, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Harold Jenkins, you're supposed to be retired, not doing my chores." Harold chuckled as he easily lifted the heavy bins and wheeled them to the curb. "If I retired completely, I'd drive Margaret crazy in heaven and myself crazy down here." Gladys laughed, leaning on her cane. "Well, I won't say no to the help. These old bones aren't what they used to be." After ensuring the bins were properly positioned, Harold turned back to his neighbor. "How's that grandson of yours doing? Still in college?" "Final year at Howard," Gladys said proudly. "That scholarship your foundation provided made all the difference." Harold waved away her thanks. "He earned it with his grades and his community service. We just made sure money wasn't an obstacle." They chatted for a few more minutes before Harold excused himself, promising to send over some of the pot roast his wife's recipe had inspired their longtime housekeeper, Rosita, to make for Sunday's family dinner. Inside his home, Harold was greeted by the comforting quiet of familiar surroundings. Though he could have afforded the most luxurious furnishings, the interior reflected the same practical elegance as its owner, quality pieces chosen for comfort and longevity rather than flash or status. Family photos lined the walls, telling the story of a life richly lived. Harold and Margaret on their wedding day, Michael's graduation, Diana as a gap-toothed child on Harold's shoulders, grandchildren opening Christmas presents, family vacations, and milestones large and small. Harold set his briefcase on the desk in his home office, a warm room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large wooden desk that had once belonged to his father. Unlike his minimalist office at the bank, this space held the accumulated treasures of a lifetime: awards and recognitions, mementos from travels, gifts from family and business associates, and most prominently, the framed first dollar he had earned from his construction business. He settled into his leather chair, feeling the familiar comfort as it accommodated his frame. From the second drawer on the right, he pulled out a folder labeled Platinum Properties and began to review its contents. As he suspected, Lawrence Morgan's company had approached First Capital Trust for financing multiple times over the past decade, and each time, Harold had found reasons to decline. It wasn't personal, or at least, it hadn't started that way. Morgan's business model simply didn't align with Harold's banking philosophy. Where Harold saw value in community investment and long-term growth, Morgan sought quick profits through luxury developments and aggressive property flipping. His proposals often involved displacing long-time residents from rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, precisely the kind of practice Harold had spent his career fighting against. Their last interaction had been 3 years ago, shortly before Margaret's diagnosis. Morgan had requested a meeting directly with Harold, a courtesy typically extended only to the bank's most valued clients. Curious about the man's persistence, Harold had agreed. The memory of that meeting was still vivid in Harold's mind as he reviewed the notes. Morgan had arrived dressed impeccably in what Harold recognized as a $5,000 suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his manner oozing the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. At 55, he was nearly 2 decades younger than Harold, a fact he seemed to think gave him an advantage. "Mr. Jenkins," Morgan had said as they shook hands, his grip unnecessarily firm. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me personally. I've been told you're the man who makes the real decisions around here." Harold had gestured for Morgan to take a seat. "I try to meet with potential clients when my schedule allows. I've reviewed your proposal for the Riverside development." Morgan had smiled, leaning forward eagerly. "It's a game changer for that area. Luxury condos with river views, high-end retail on the ground floor. We're talking about transforming a struggling neighborhood into a destination." "I'm familiar with that neighborhood," Harold had replied evenly. "My company built several of the apartment buildings there in the 1980s. There are 300 families living in the buildings you plan to demolish." Morgan had waved a dismissive hand. "All legal, I assure you. The relocation packages are generous by any standard. And let's be honest, that area has been declining for years. This development will increase property values across the board." "For those who can afford to stay," Harold had noted. A flash of irritation had crossed Morgan's face before his practiced smile returned. Progress always comes with change, Mr. Jenkins. I would think a man like you would understand that. You didn't build your... He had paused, glancing around the elegant office. Empire by clinging to the past. On the contrary, Harold had replied, I built it by respecting the past while planning for the future. By understanding that communities are more than just buildings or investment opportunities. They're people with histories and connections. Morgan's smile had tightened. Noble sentiments. But we're in the business of banking, not social work. Your shareholders might question turning down a guaranteed return on investment for sentiment. That had been Morgan's first mistake, assuming Harold answered to shareholders like most bank executives. In fact, Harold maintained controlling interest in First Capital Trust specifically to prevent the kind of short-term profit-driven decisions that Morgan was suggesting. Mr. Morgan, Harold had said calmly, I've been in business long enough to know that true success isn't measured by a single quarter's profits. First Capital Trust has outperformed the industry average for 20 consecutive years, precisely because we invest in sustainable growth, not quick flips. Morgan had leaned back, his expression calculating. I've done my research on you, Jenkins. Started with nothing, built a construction company, leveraged that into real estate holdings, then acquired this bank during the financial crisis. It's an impressive story, self-made man and all that. Harold had remained silent, waiting for Morgan to reach his point. But banking has changed, Morgan had continued. The margins are tighter, the regulations more constricting. You need partners who understand how to navigate the new landscape. Partners like Platinum Properties. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morgan? Morgan had smiled, sensing an opening. A strategic partnership. Your bank provides the financing for our developments, exclusive terms, naturally. And in return, Platinum offers First Capital first rights on all our future projects. We're expanding into 3 new markets next year. That's significant growth potential for your loan portfolio. Harold had studied Morgan thoughtfully. And the Riverside development? What happens to those 300 families? Morgan's expression had hardened slightly. That's not the bank's concern. But if it eases your conscience, we could perhaps set aside a few units, 5% say, for affordable housing. A gesture of goodwill. The condescension in Morgan's tone when he said affordable housing had told Harold everything he needed to know about the man's character. He had risen from his chair, signaling that the meeting was over. Thank you for your time, Mr. Morgan, but I don't think our institutions are well aligned. First Capital Trust will be declining your loan application. Morgan's confident smile had faltered. You're making a mistake, Jenkins. This deal could be worth millions to your bank. Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Morgan. I wish you luck finding financing elsewhere. Morgan had stood, his composure slipping further. You know, for someone who's supposedly so forward-thinking, you're remarkably stuck in the past. Banking is evolving. If you can't evolve with it, you'll be left behind. Perhaps, Harold had acknowledged, but I'll still be able to look my community in the eye. Can you say the same? Morgan's face had flushed with anger. This isn't over, Jenkins. One way or another, that development is happening. Harold was pulled from his memory by the sound of his phone ringing. Glancing at the caller ID, he saw it was Michael. Hello, son, he answered warmly. Dad? Michael's voice held a note of concern. I just got off the phone with Diana. She told me about what happened at the bank today. Harold sighed. It was nothing, Michael. Just a misunderstanding. That's not how Diana described it, Michael replied. And she also mentioned that her big case is against Platinum Properties. Is that Morgan's company? Yes, Harold confirmed. But Diana doesn't need me interfering. She's more than capable of handling Morgan in court. Michael was quiet for a moment. Dad, you know Morgan's reputation. He doesn't play fair, and he holds grudges. If he connects Diana to you, then he'll realize he's up against someone even more formidable than he thought, Harold finished. Diana's a Jenkins, Michael. She doesn't scare easily. Michael chuckled despite his concern. That's true enough. Listen, I was thinking about Sunday dinner. Is it okay if I invite James? He's been working on the community center design nonstop, and I think he could use a home-cooked meal. James Chen was Michael's protege at Jenkins Construction, a brilliant young architect with innovative ideas about sustainable urban development. Harold had taken an immediate liking to the young man, who reminded him somewhat of himself at that age, passionate, hard-working, and unafraid to challenge conventional thinking. Of course, Harold said. You know James is always welcome. Rosita always makes enough to feed an army anyway. After chatting with his son for a few more minutes about business matters and family news, Harold ended the call and returned to the Platinum Properties file. He added a note about Diana's case against the company, then closed the folder and returned it to his drawer. His attention shifted to a small framed photo on his desk, one of his favorites. It showed him and Margaret standing in front of the first house his company had built, a modest ranch-style home that had represented everything they were working toward. Margaret was pregnant with Michael at the time, her face glowing with youth and promise. Harold himself looked impossibly young, his smile wide with pride despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. That first house had nearly broken him. The bank had pulled his financing halfway through construction, claiming unforeseen market conditions, but really responding to complaints from white residents who didn't want a black-owned business developing in their neighborhood. Harold had been forced to take out a second mortgage on their small apartment and work night shifts at a factory to complete the project. Margaret had kept the books, negotiated with suppliers, and even pitched in with painting and landscaping, all while carrying their first child. They had finished the house, sold it for a modest profit, and immediately started on the next one. Then another, and another. Each project got a little bigger, each success built on the one before it. By the time Michael was born, Jenkins Construction had 5 employees and contracts for 3 new homes. The following Monday morning, Blake Thompson stood outside the West Side Community branch of First Capital Trust, tugging nervously at his tie. The branch was housed in a modest building on a busy commercial street, surrounded by small businesses that catered to the working-class neighborhood, a barber shop, a family-owned hardware store, a Dominican restaurant, and a small grocery store, with produce displayed in wooden crates outside. It was a far cry from the gleaming marble and glass of the downtown headquarters, where Blake had worked for the past 3 years. There, he had cultivated the persona of a rising star, dressing in suits that cost more than he could afford, and adopting the mannerisms of the wealthy clients he hoped to serve. Here he felt conspicuously out of place in his designer suit and Italian leather shoes. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was clean and professional but utilitarian, with simple desks instead of the private cubicles he was accustomed to. A line of customers already stretched from the teller windows, workers depositing paychecks before their shifts, small business owners making cash drops, elderly residents conducting their weekly banking. "You must be Blake," a voice called out. A woman in her mid-50s approached, extending her hand. "I'm Evelyn Carter, branch manager. Mr. Reynolds called to let me know you'd be joining us for the month." Blake shook her hand, forcing a smile. "Yes, that's me. Blake Thompson. Thank you for having me." Evelyn's grip was firm, her gaze direct and assessing. "Did Marcus explain what you'll be doing here?" "Not specifically," Blake admitted. "Just that I'd be rotating through community branches to broaden my experience. Something in Evelyn's expression suggested she knew more about the circumstances of his assignment than she was letting on, but she simply nodded and gestured for him to follow her. We're short-staffed today, so you'll be jumping right in at the teller window. Don't worry, Jamal will show you the ropes. It's a bit different from what you're used to downtown. Before Blake could respond, she led him to a young man who was efficiently handling a line of customers. Jamal briefly looked up as they approached, offering a quick nod while continuing to count out bills for the customer in front of him. Jamal, this is Blake from downtown. He'll be with us for a few weeks. Can you get him set up at window 3 once you've finished with this customer? Sure thing, Ms. Carter, Jamal replied, his hands never pausing in their counting. Evelyn turned back to Blake. Jamal's one of our best. Been with us for 2 years now, working his way through college. He'll teach you everything you need to know about serving our community members. With that, she left Blake standing awkwardly beside the teller window, watching as Jamal completed the transaction with practiced efficiency. Have a blessed day, Mrs. Washington, Jamal said warmly to the elderly woman he'd been helping. Don't forget to take your medication. My grandmother always tries to skip those blood pressure pills too. The woman chuckled, tucking her receipt into her purse. You tell your grandma that Clara says hello and that we both need to listen to our doctors. As Mrs. Washington shuffled away, Jamal turned to Blake with an appraising look. First time working a teller window? Blake nodded, feeling strangely intimidated by this younger man's confidence. I've been in customer service at the main branch. Well, forget everything you learned there, Jamal said matter-of-factly as he logged out of his terminal. Different world down here. Come on, I'll get you set up. Across town, Melissa Winters was having a similar experience at the East Point branch. Located in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, the branch was busy with Monday morning activity, mothers with children in tow, day laborers cashing checks, small business owners making deposits. You speak any Spanish? Asked Luisa Gonzalez, the assistant branch manager who had been assigned to orient her. Melissa shook her head. Just what I remember from high school. Hola and gracias, basically. Luisa sighed. Well, about half our customers prefer Spanish, so you'll be learning on the job. For now, I'll put you with Carmen at the new accounts desk. She can translate when needed. As Melissa followed Luisa through the branch, she couldn't help noticing how different the atmosphere was from downtown. There, interactions were brief and transactional. Here, customers greeted staff by name, asked about family members, brought homemade food to share. Our customers aren't just account numbers, Luisa explained, seeming to read Melissa's thoughts. They're neighbors. Some have been banking with us for generations. Others are opening their first accounts ever. Many send remittances to family back home every month. That money puts food on tables and sends kids to school in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala. The pride in Luisa's voice was unmistakable, and Melissa felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, the realization that her own work had never given her that sense of purpose. Meanwhile, at First Capital Trust's downtown headquarters, Harold Jenkins was in an unexpected meeting. Lawrence Morgan had requested to see him, claiming it was about a matter of mutual interest. Curious about what might have prompted this visit after their last contentious encounter, Harold had agreed. Morgan arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. If he was surprised to find Harold dressed in his usual simple attire rather than executive finery, he didn't show it. "Jenkins," Morgan greeted him with a tight smile, "thank you for making time to see me." Harold gestured to the chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morgan?" "Your assistant mentioned a matter of mutual interest." Morgan settled into the chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "I'll get right to it. I understand your granddaughter is representing the Thompson family in their case against one of my subsidiary companies. Harold's expression remained neutral, though inwardly he was alert. Diana is an accomplished attorney. Her cases are her own business. Of course, Morgan said smoothly. I'm not suggesting otherwise. In fact, I admire family loyalty. It's something of a lost virtue these days, don't you think? Harold simply waited, knowing Morgan hadn't come all this way for philosophical discussions about family values. Morgan leaned forward slightly. The thing is, Jenkins, that case is headed for a messy, drawn-out legal battle that won't benefit anyone. The Thompsons will exhaust their limited resources. Your granddaughter will invest countless hours for what I assume is minimal compensation, and my company will incur unnecessary legal fees. If you're concerned about legal fees, you could simply honor the Thompsons' lease as they've requested, Harold suggested mildly. Morgan's smile tightened. That property is scheduled for redevelopment as part of a larger project that will create jobs and revitalize a struggling area. Surely you can appreciate the greater good. I appreciate ethical business practices, Harold replied. But as I said, Diana's cases are her business. If you have a settlement offer, you should direct it to her. I tried, Morgan admitted, his facade of affability slipping slightly. She refused to even consider it. That's why I thought perhaps you might encourage her to be more reasonable. Harold allowed himself a small smile. Mr. Morgan, if you've met my granddaughter, you should know that encouraging her to do anything against her judgment is a futile endeavor. She makes her own decisions. Morgan studied Harold for a moment, then changed tactics. Let me be direct, Jenkins. That development is happening. The financing is secured, the permits are approved, and construction begins in 60 days. The only question is whether the Thompsons leave with a generous settlement or with nothing. Is that a threat? Harold asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. A reality check, Morgan corrected. Business is business, nothing personal. But it occurs to me that First Capital Trust has branches in several neighborhoods where Platinum is planning future developments. It would be a shame if zoning changes or construction disruptions affected your operations. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Harold leaned back in his chair, regarding Morgan thoughtfully. Mr. Morgan, let me share something with you that might provide some context for our conversation. Do you know how I came to own this bank? The abrupt change in topic seemed to catch Morgan off guard. I understand you acquired it during the financial crisis, he said cautiously. Harold nodded. 2008. The previous owners had made a series of increasingly risky investments, chasing higher returns without considering the potential consequences. When the market collapsed, so did they. Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city he had watched evolve over decades. They came to me because my construction and real estate companies were still solvent. I had refused to participate in the subprime lending frenzy, even when everyone said I was leaving money on the table. They needed a bailout, quickly and quietly. He turned back to face Morgan. I could have let them fail. Many would have said they deserved to, but I saw an opportunity to transform an institution that had once refused me a loan into one that would serve people like me. People who needed a fair chance, not predatory terms. Morgan shifted in his seat, clearly wondering where this history lesson was heading. The point, Mr. Morgan, is that I didn't build what I have by bowing to pressure or threats, and neither did my granddaughter. If you want to resolve your legal issues with the Thompson family, I suggest you offer them fair terms that respect their rights and dignity. Morgan's expression hardened. And if I don't? Then I imagine Diana will see you in court, Harold replied simply. And based on what I know of both of you, I wouldn't bet against her. Morgan stood, adjusting his cuffs with calculated precision. I had hoped for a more productive conversation, Jenkins. Your reputation suggested a practical businessman, not a sentimental old man. Harold smiled. Many have underestimated me over the years, Mr. Morgan. It rarely ends well for them. As Morgan turned to leave, Harold added, "One more thing. If any zoning changes or construction disruptions should coincidentally affect my branches, I might be forced to take a much closer look at the financing behind your current developments. Banking regulations can be quite complex, as I'm sure you're aware." Morgan paused at the door, his back stiffening slightly before he nodded once and departed without another word. After Morgan left, Harold sat quietly for several minutes, considering the implications of the encounter. The fact that Morgan had attempted to use Diana's case as leverage suggested a certain desperation, or perhaps more concerning, a willingness to play dirty that went beyond normal business tactics. He reached for his phone and dialed Diana's number, but after 2 rings, he ended the call. His granddaughter was more than capable of handling Morgan's legal maneuverings. Warning her about the encounter might only distract her or, worse, make her feel he didn't trust her abilities. Instead, he called Marcus Reynolds. "Marcus, I need you to pull together some information for me," he said when the branch manager answered. "Everything we have on Platinum Properties' financial structure, subsidiaries, investors, loan sources, and contact Evelyn Carter at Westside and Luisa Gonzalez at East Point. I want daily reports on how our visitors from downtown are adjusting to community banking." "Of course, Mr. Jenkins," Marcus replied. "Any particular reason for the interest in Platinum?" "Just due diligence," Harold said. "And Marcus? Keep this between us for now." After ending the call, Harold turned back to the window. In the reflection of the glass, he could see the portrait of Margaret that hung on his office wall. Her gentle smile seemed to carry a message across time, a reminder of conversations they'd had, values they'd shared. "I know, Maggie," he murmured to the empty room. "Some battles should be left to the next generation, but sometimes they need someone watching their backs." By the end of his first week at the Westside branch, Blake Thompson's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. His designer shirts were wrinkled from the longer commute, his polished demeanor dulled by exhaustion. The teller window had proven to be a humbling experience, a never-ending stream of transactions, each with its own complications and human stories attached. "Mr. Rodriguez needs to send $200 to his mother in Honduras," Jamal explained on Friday afternoon, as an elderly man approached Blake's window. "The system might flag it because he's sent 3 remittances this month already, but it's because his sister is having surgery. Just override the alert with code 47B and note family medical emergency in the comments." Blake nodded, trying to process this information while maintaining a professional smile for Mr. Rodriguez. "Good afternoon, sir. I understand you need to send money to Honduras today." The elderly man nodded, placing 2 worn $100 bills on the counter. "For my mama," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "She is 87 years. My sister Teresa, she needs the operation." As Blake began processing the transaction, he found himself wondering about Mr. Rodriguez's story. At the downtown branch, he rarely engaged with customers beyond the immediate transaction. There were procedures to follow, quotas to meet, potential high-value clients to identify and refer to management. Here, Jamal knew not just Mr. Rodriguez's name, but his family situation, the reason for his frequent transactions, even details about his work as a building superintendent. And it wasn't just Mr. Rodriguez. Jamal seemed to have this level of knowledge about dozens of regular customers. "How do you remember all this?" Blake asked during a rare quiet moment. "There must be hundreds of people who come through here." Jamal shrugged. "You just listen. People tell you their stories if you pay attention. Besides, It makes the job easier when you understand what people actually need, not just what transaction they're requesting. Blake considered this as he watched Jamal handle his next customer, a young woman with twin toddlers squirming in a double stroller. Jamal greeted the children by name, asked about the woman's new job, and processed her deposit with efficiency while making silly faces at the twins to keep them entertained. It was banking, but not as Blake had practiced it. It was human. At the East Point branch, Melissa was having her own revelations. Paired with Carmen at the new accounts desk, she had spent the week observing how the older woman served customers with a combination of professionalism and personal warmth that transcended language barriers. "Many of our customers are opening their first bank accounts ever," Carmen had explained. "In their home countries, banks were for rich people, not for workers. They've survived on cash their whole lives, and trusting an institution with their money requires enormous faith." Melissa had watched as Carmen patiently walked a young couple through the process of opening a joint checking account, explaining every fee, every feature, answering questions in Spanish and English interchangeably. The pride on the couple's faces when they received their first debit cards was unlike anything Melissa had witnessed at the downtown branch. Now, on Friday afternoon, Carmen turned to Melissa. "Your turn. Mrs. Diaz is coming in at 3 to open a savings account for her grandson's college fund. She speaks very little English, so you'll need to use the translation cards I prepared for you." Melissa felt a flutter of anxiety. "Shouldn't you handle it? My Spanish is terrible." Carmen shook her head firmly. "You've been watching all week. Now you do. I watch. Don't worry. Mrs. Diaz is very patient." When the elderly woman arrived, clutching a plastic bag containing what Melissa would later learn was her life savings in cash, Melissa summoned her courage and greeted her with a carefully practiced "Buenas tardes, Señora Diaz." The woman's face lit up at the attempt, and she launched into a rapid stream of Spanish that left Melissa momentarily overwhelmed. But with Carmen's occasional assistance and the translation cards, they managed to communicate. By the end of the hour-long process, Mrs. Diaz had a new savings account with automatic monthly deposits set up from her Social Security checks, and Melissa had experienced a profound sense of accomplishment unlike any commission-driven success at headquarters. As Mrs. Diaz was leaving, she suddenly turned back and pressed a small package into Melissa's hands. "Para ti," she said, miming eating. Inside were homemade empanadas, still warm. "She brings them every Friday," Carmen explained with a smile. "I told her it was your first week. That means she likes you." Melissa stared at the simple gift, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. At the downtown branch, accepting anything from customers was strictly against policy. It could suggest favoritism or impropriety. Here, refusing Mrs. Diaz's gesture would have been the greater offense. "Thank you," she said, the words catching slightly in her throat. "Gracias." Across town, Diana Jenkins sat in her office at Bradford Wells and Schmidt, surrounded by stacks of documents related to the Thompson case. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as she reviewed lease agreements, correspondence between the Thompsons and their landlord, and the development plans for the building. On paper, Platinum Properties' position seemed legally sound. They had acquired the building through a subsidiary company, provided required notices to tenants, and offered relocation assistance that technically met legal minimums. But Diana had spent enough time with the Thompson family to know the human cost behind those technicalities. Samuel and Lydia Thompson had lived in their apartment for 23 years. They had raised 3 children there, established deep connections in the community, and built their small tailoring business in a commercial space on the ground floor. The relocation assistance offered by Platinum amounted to 2 months' rent, barely enough to cover moving expenses and security deposits, let alone the higher rents they would face elsewhere, or the cost of relocating their business. Diana rubbed her eyes, fatigue setting in after a long week. As she reached for her coffee mug, a knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her paralegal with the additional filings she had requested. Instead, Lawrence Morgan himself stepped into her office, immaculately dressed and wearing the confident smile of a predator. Diana's expression remained neutral as she stood. "Mr. Morgan, this is unexpected." "Ms. Jenkins," Morgan greeted her, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "As a matter of fact, you are," Diana replied coolly. "I was just reviewing the Thompson case. If you'd like to discuss it, you should contact my office to schedule a proper meeting with your legal team present." Morgan waved a dismissive hand. "No need for such formalities. I thought perhaps we could speak frankly, one professional to another." Diana crossed her arms. "In that case, as one professional to another, I'll remind you that approaching opposing counsel without their client's knowledge is ethically questionable at best." Morgan's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in his eyes. "I see the family resemblance now. Your grandfather has the same direct approach." Diana stiffened slightly at the mention of Harold, but maintained her composure. "If you've spoken with my grandfather about this case, that would constitute another ethical concern. Just a casual conversation between business associates," Morgan said smoothly. "But it did make me curious about you, Ms. Jenkins. Harvard Law, clerkship with Judge Ramirez on the federal circuit, offers from top firms in New York and D.C. Yet here you are in a mid-sized local firm, taking on cases like the Thompsons. It's an unusual career trajectory for someone with your credentials." "I don't see how my career choices are relevant to the Thompson case," Diana replied. Morgan stepped further into the office, glancing at the framed photos on her bookshelf. Diana with her grandfather at her law school graduation, with her father at a charity event with clients from previous cases. "Family business," Morgan mused, picking up the photo of Diana and Harold. "I understand the pull of legacy. My father built Platinum from nothing, just as your grandfather built his empire. We're not so different, you and I." Diana took the frame from his hands and replaced it on the shelf. "Mr. Morgan, I have work to finish. If you'd like to make a settlement offer for the Thompsons, I'm happy to review it with them." Morgan's pretense of cordiality faded slightly. $500,000. More than generous for a month-to-month lease on a property that size. They can relocate their business, buy new equipment, even put a down payment on a house if they're prudent. Diana raised an eyebrow. "That's significantly more than your previous offer. Why the sudden generosity?" "Let's call it an investment in community goodwill," Morgan replied. "Platinum values its reputation." "I'll present the offer to my clients," Diana said, making notes on a legal pad. "Though I should tell you, the Thompsons' primary concern isn't monetary compensation. They want to remain in their home and business location." Morgan's expression hardened further. "That's not an option. The development is proceeding on schedule." "Then I'll see you in court," Diana said simply. "Now, if there's nothing else, I really do need to finish this work." Morgan studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "I look forward to seeing you in action, Ms. Jenkins. Your reputation precedes you." As he turned to leave, he added, "Give my regards to your grandfather. Tell him I said our conversation was illuminating." After Morgan departed, Diana sat motionless, considering the implications of his visit. The increased settlement offer was significant, suggesting Platinum might be concerned about the case despite their confident posturing. But more troubling was Morgan's casual mention of Harold, the implication that they had discussed her case. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. Her grandfather respected her independence, her professional capabilities. If he had somehow become entangled in this case, he would have his reasons. Still, the boundary between her work and family matters had always been important to her. With a sigh, she returned to the documents, but her concentration was broken. The setting sun cast Morgan's shadow across her desk long after he had gone. Meanwhile, Harold was in his home office, reviewing the preliminary information Marcus had compiled on Platinum Properties. The company's structure was complex, a web of subsidiaries, holding companies and offshore entities designed to obscure ownership and minimize tax liability. It was legal, but barely, operating in the gray areas of financial regulations. What interested Harold most, however, was the financing behind Platinum's recent expansion. The company had embarked on an aggressive growth strategy over the past year, acquiring properties across multiple neighborhoods and planning large-scale developments that seemed to outpace their historical financial capacity. Harold leaned back in his chair, contemplating the implications. Either Morgan had found new investors with deep pockets, or he was leveraging his existing assets to a potentially dangerous degree. Either way, it represented both a threat and an opportunity. His phone rang, interrupting his analysis. The caller ID showed Evelyn Carter from the West Side branch. "Evelyn," Harold greeted her warmly. "How are things at West Side?" "Busy as always, Mr. Jenkins," she replied. "I'm calling with that update you requested on our visitor from downtown." Harold chuckled. "And how is young Mr. Thompson adjusting to life in the trenches?" "Better than I expected, honestly," Evelyn admitted. "He started out exactly as you'd imagine, all polish and procedure, treating customers like transactions. But Jamal's been a good influence. Blake's actually listening, learning the rhythms of the branch." "Any specific observations?" Harold asked, making notes. "He stayed late yesterday to help Mrs. Wilson sort out an error with her pension deposit. Didn't rush her, didn't make her feel stupid for being confused. That's progress from the young man who arrived here looking like he'd been sentenced to prison." Harold smiled. "And his interactions with the staff?" "Still finding his footing there," Evelyn said. "He's used to a more hierarchical environment. But he brought coffee for everyone this morning. Not the fancy stuff from downtown, but from Ms. Ellie's place across the street. Shows he's paying attention to local businesses." "Good, good," Harold murmured. "Keep me posted on his progress." After ending the call, Harold received a similar report from Louisa about Melissa's adaptation at the East Point branch. The young woman had apparently shown surprising patience with elderly customers and had begun creating simple Spanish phrase cards to help with common banking terms. Harold leaned back in his chair, satisfied with these preliminary reports. People could change when given the right environment and incentives. The question was whether these changes would stick once Blake and Melissa returned to headquarters, or if they would revert to their previous behavior. As darkness fell outside his window, Harold's thoughts turned to Morgan's visit to Diana's office, which Marcus had discreetly informed him about through his network of contacts. The increased settlement offer was interesting, a sign that perhaps Platinum wasn't as confident in their legal position as they claimed. But Harold knew Morgan well enough now to suspect there was more to the story. Men like Lawrence Morgan didn't make generous offers out of concern for community goodwill. Something else was driving his sudden flexibility, and Harold was determined to find out what it was. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely used these days. "Robert? It's Harold Jenkins. I need a favor from an old friend." Robert Chen had been Harold's accountant for nearly 40 years, but their relationship went deeper than numbers on a balance sheet. In the early days of Jenkins Construction, when Harold was struggling to secure financing for projects in redline neighborhoods, Robert had been one of the few financial professionals willing to work with a black entrepreneur. As a Chinese immigrant facing his own barriers in the business world, Robert understood the challenges of building success in a system designed to exclude. Now, in his late 70s, Robert had officially retired 5 years ago, handing his accounting firm over to his daughter, but he maintained a select group of clients, old friends like Harold, for whom he would always make time. "Harold," Robert greeted warmly over the phone. "It's been too long. How's the family?" "Everyone's well," Harold replied. "Michael's company just landed the community center contract, and Diana made partner at her firm." "Excellent news. And how is your retirement treating you?" There was a hint of humor in Robert's voice. They both knew Harold's version of retirement involved nearly as much work as his active career had. "Busy enough to keep me out of trouble," Harold chuckled. "Speaking of which, I need your expertise on something confidential." Robert's tone turned serious. "Of course, what do you need?" "Information on Platinum Properties, their financing structure, investor profiles, debt-to-asset ratios. Particularly for their recent acquisitions and developments, something doesn't add up." There was a thoughtful pause on the line. "Lawrence Morgan's company? I've heard rumors about their aggressive expansion. Let me see what I can find through my channels. This may take a few days." "I appreciate it, old friend. And Robert, this stays between us for now." "As always," Robert assured him before ending the call. Harold set his phone down and turned his attention to the file Marcus had compiled. Among the various documents was a list of properties Platinum had recently acquired or had under contract. He noticed a pattern emerging. Many were in neighborhoods adjacent to existing First Capital Trust community branches. It could be coincidence, but Harold had built his success on recognizing patterns where others saw random events. The next morning, Saturday, found Blake Thompson in an unexpected location. Rather than sleeping in after his exhausting first week at the West Side branch, he was back in the neighborhood, standing outside a small barber shop called Carter's Classic Cuts. Through the window, he could see Jamal chatting with an older man who was trimming the hair of a young boy. Taking a deep breath, Blake pushed open the door, setting a small bell jingling. "Blake?" Jamal looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Blake felt painfully out of place in his casual weekend clothes, which still managed to look too polished for the modest shop. "You mentioned your uncle's barber shop needed help with their banking. Something about merchant services fees?" Jamal's surprise turned to a grin. "Yeah, Uncle Ray's been getting killed on processing fees for credit card payments. Didn't think you'd actually come check it out, though." The older barber looked up from his young client. "This the bank guy you mentioned? Doesn't look old enough to balance a checkbook." "Uncle Ray, this is Blake from First Capital. Blake, my Uncle Raymond Carter." Ray Carter gave Blake an appraising look. "You related to Evelyn Carter at the bank?" "No, sir," Blake replied. "I'm just working with her temporarily. I'm usually at the downtown branch." "Downtown, huh?" Ray finished the boy's haircut and gestured for him to hop down from the chair. "And you came all the way out here on your day off? Must be one hell of a commission." Blake felt his face flush. "No commission. I just thought maybe I could help." Ray handed the boy a lollipop and collected payment from his mother before turning back to Blake. "Well, come on then. I've got about 20 minutes before my next appointment. Show me what you've got downtown." For the next half hour, Blake reviewed the barbershop's merchant services agreement, explaining the complicated fee structure in terms Ray could understand, and identifying several unnecessary charges he was paying. By the time Ray's next client arrived, Blake had outlined a plan that would save the small business nearly $200 a month. "Not bad, young man," Ray admitted, genuinely impressed. "Jamal said you were smart, but I figured you for one of those types who only cares about big accounts." Blake found himself unable to deny the accuracy of Ray's initial assessment. A week ago, that was exactly the type of banker he had been, or at least had been trying to be. "I'm learning there's more to banking than big accounts," he said simply. Ray nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Lesson worth learning. Now how about a haircut while you're here? On the house." Blake touched his carefully styled hair, which cost him $150 at an exclusive salon downtown. Come on, man, Jamal laughed. Uncle Ray's been cutting hair for 30 years. Trust me, he won't mess you up. Surrendering to the moment, Blake settled into the barber chair, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity as Ray draped the cape around him. "So," Ray asked conversationally as he began to work, "how did a downtown guy like you end up at Westside? Evelyn runs a tight ship. She doesn't usually take transfers unless there's a story." Blake hesitated, embarrassed to admit the truth. But something about the straightforward question and the man's genuine interest made him decide on honesty. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "Judged someone by their appearance. Turns out he was the owner of the entire bank." Ray's hands paused briefly before resuming their skilled work. "Harold Jenkins?" Blake turned his head in surprise, earning a gentle correction from Ray. "You know Mr. Jenkins?" Ray chuckled. "Everyone in this neighborhood knows Harold. His company renovated half the buildings on this block back in the 80s when no one else would invest here. And that branch you're working at? It exists because Harold insisted the bank serve communities other institutions had written off." As Ray continued cutting his hair, he shared stories about Harold's impact on the neighborhood, from the affordable housing developments that allowed families like his to purchase homes, to the small business loans that helped establish many of the shops along the commercial strip. By the time his haircut was finished, a subtle but significant improvement over his previous style, Blake had to admit, his understanding of both Harold Jenkins and the community had deepened considerably. "What do I owe you for the cut?" Blake asked, reaching for his wallet. Ray waved him off. "I told you, it's on the house. Just make sure you follow through on those merchant services changes. And maybe tell your boss downtown that Ray Carter said Harold Jenkins was right. There's value in these neighborhoods if you know where to look." Across town, Melissa Winters was also spending her Saturday in an unexpected way. Following Carmen's suggestion, she had volunteered at a financial literacy workshop being held at the East Point branch. The program, designed to help community members understand basic banking concepts, credit management, and saving strategies, was conducted in both English and Spanish. Melissa had been assigned to help with the children's activities, a station where kids could practice counting money, learn about saving through interactive games, and even open play bank accounts complete with passbooks and pretend checks. Miss Melissa," 6-year-old Sophia tugged at her sleeve. "I saved $10 this week. Can I put it in my bank?" Melissa smiled, helping the little girl count out play money into her paper piggy bank. "That's wonderful, Sophia. And what are you saving for?" "A bicycle," Sophia declared proudly. "A purple one with streamers on the handlebars." "That's an excellent goal," Melissa said, helping Sophia fill out her play passbook. "How much do you need to save?" $100, Sophia said. "Mama says if I save half, she will pay the other half." The genuine pride in the child's voice as she discussed her modest savings goal touched something in Melissa. At the downtown branch, she regularly processed transactions worth thousands of dollars without a second thought. Here, a child's $10 represented discipline, sacrifice, and dreams. In the adult workshop nearby, Carmen was explaining predatory lending practices and how to recognize financial scams. Melissa listened with growing respect as Carmen patiently answered questions, offering practical advice tailored to the community's specific concerns. "Remember," Carmen emphasized, "a legitimate bank will never ask you to wire money to release a loan. If someone claims to be from a bank and requests payment by gift cards or money transfer, it's a scam." Several participants nodded, sharing stories of friends or family who had been victimized by such schemes. Melissa realized that the financial education she took for granted was a powerful tool these community members had been denied. When the workshop ended, Carmen approached Melissa with an appreciative smile. "You're good with the children. They responded well to you. Melissa shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. They make it easy. They're so excited about learning. Carmen nodded. That's why these programs matter. We're not just teaching them about money. We're showing them they belong in spaces like banks. That financial institutions should serve them, not exploit them. The simple statement resonated with Melissa in a way she hadn't expected. At the downtown branch, customers were evaluated based on their potential value to the bank. Here, the equation was reversed. The bank's value was measured by its service to the community. Will you come to the next workshop? Carmen asked. It's in 2 weeks. We could use your help again. Melissa found herself nodding before she'd even consciously decided. I'd like that. Sunday afternoon found the Jenkins family gathered at Harold's home for their traditional weekly dinner. The dining room was filled with the delicious aromas of Rosita's cooking and the warm sounds of family conversation. Michael and his wife Sarah discussed their teenage son's college prospects, while Diana shared amusing stories from her law practice, carefully avoiding any mention of the Thompson case or Lawrence Morgan. James Chen, Michael's protege, had indeed joined them, bringing a bottle of wine and engaging Harold in a detailed conversation about sustainable building materials. The young architect's enthusiasm reminded Harold of himself decades earlier, the same burning desire to create, to build something meaningful and lasting. Mr. Jenkins, James said earnestly as they moved from the dining room to the more comfortable seating in the living room, I've been studying your early projects, the Riverside Homes development in particular. The way you incorporated green space and community areas was revolutionary for that time. Harold smiled, pleased by the young man's genuine interest in work that predated his birth. Necessity as much as innovation, I'm afraid. The lot was irregular, and conventional layouts would have reduced the number of units we could build while still meeting code requirements for parking. But the central courtyard concept you created became a gathering space that brought the community together, James pointed out. I've interviewed several original residents as part of my research. They all mention how that design fostered neighborly connections. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Margaret's influence. She insisted that buildings should serve people, not just house them, said a development without community spaces was just a collection of boxes. The conversation continued, drifting from architecture to urban planning to the community center project James and Michael were currently designing. Harold listened more than he spoke, drawing satisfaction from seeing his son and this promising young architect building on the foundation he had laid. Across the room, Diana was engaged in conversation with Sarah about her boy's upcoming college applications when her phone buzzed with a text message. Glancing down, she was surprised to see it was from one of her paralegals, unusual for a Sunday. Need to talk ASAP. Found something in Platinum Properties docs you should see. Diana frowned slightly, then excused herself to make a quick call from Harold's study. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression was thoughtful, preoccupied. Harold, ever attuned to his granddaughter's moods, caught her eye with a questioning look. She gave a small shake of her head, not now, but he could tell something significant had happened. As the evening wound down and family members began to depart, Diana lingered, helping Harold clear the last of the dishes despite Rosita's protests that it was her job. Everything all right? Harold asked when they were alone in the kitchen. Diana hesitated, then decided on directness. My paralegal found something strange in the Platinum Properties documentation. The building where the Thompsons live, it appears to be central to a much larger development than what's been publicly announced, and there's a connection to a company called Maritime Ventures LLC. Harold's expression remained neutral, but his interest was piqued. Maritime Ventures? I'm not familiar with them. Neither was I, Diana admitted. But according to my paralegal, they're the primary financial backer for Platinum's entire Riverside development project. Without their investment, the project collapses. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. And you're telling me this because... Diana met his gaze directly. Because Morgan came to see me on Friday. He mentioned having a conversation with you, implied that you might encourage me to accept his settlement offer. Did he now? Harold's voice was calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. And what did you tell him? That I'd present his offer to my clients, Diana replied. But Grandpa, if he's trying to use our relationship as leverage... Harold placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Diana, I have never and would never interfere with your professional judgment. Morgan came to see me as well, made some thinly veiled threats about zoning changes affecting our branches. I told him what I'm telling you now. We don't bow to pressure. Diana's tension visibly eased. I knew that, but I needed to hear it. And now I'm even more curious about what's really behind this development. If Maritime Ventures is so crucial to the project, who are they, and what's their interest? A very good question, Harold agreed. One worth investigating thoroughly. What he didn't share was that Robert Chen had already begun looking into Maritime Ventures as part of his research into Platinum's financing structure. Some instinct told Harold to wait for Robert's findings before discussing it further, even with Diana. As they finished clearing the kitchen, Diana changed the subject. How are those two customer service representatives doing at the community branches? Blake and Melissa, right? Harold smiled. According to their branch managers, they're making surprising progress. Seems they both have potential they weren't using downtown. I'm still not sure why you didn't just fire them, Diana admitted. Most people in your position would have. Most people in my position haven't walked the path I have, Harold replied simply. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes, especially when those mistakes come from ignorance rather than malice. Diana hugged her grandfather tightly. You're a better person than most, Grandpa. Not better, Harold corrected gently. Just older. I've had more time to learn what matters. Wednesday morning, Harold arrived at his office earlier than usual. Robert Chen had called the previous evening with news about Maritime Ventures LLC, and the information was troubling enough to warrant immediate attention. As Harold reviewed the documents Robert had sent over, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a way that explained Morgan's aggressive expansion and sudden interest in the Thompson case. Maritime Ventures, according to Robert's research, was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Its ownership was deliberately obscured through multiple layers of corporate entities. But Robert had managed to trace it back to its source, a consortium of foreign investors led by a Chinese development company called Eastern Horizon Group. The implications were significant. Foreign investment in real estate development wasn't unusual, but this particular structure suggested the investors were deliberately maintaining distance from the projects. More concerning was Eastern Horizon's reputation for acquiring large swaths of property in developing nations, building luxury developments that displaced local residents, then selling the properties at massive profits before moving on to the next opportunity. It appeared that Morgan had found international backing for his ambitious plans, backers who cared even less about community impact than he did. The question was why they had chosen these specific neighborhoods and what their ultimate goal might be. Harold was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't notice Catherine Yates, the regional director, waiting in his doorway until she gently cleared her throat. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Jenkins, she said. Do you have a moment? Harold looked up, quickly gathering the papers into a folder. Of course, Catherine. Come in. Catherine settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression suggesting she had something important to discuss. I've been reviewing the reports from the West Side and East Point branches about our two visitors from downtown. Harold nodded, setting aside the Maritime Ventures information for later. And? How are our young friends adapting? Surprisingly well, Catherine admitted. Both branch managers have submitted positive evaluations. Blake Thompson has shown particular aptitude for small business services. He's been working with several local merchants to optimize their banking arrangements, and Melissa Winters has been volunteering with our financial literacy program on weekends. Harold couldn't hide his satisfaction. I thought they might surprise us, given the right environment. Catherine tilted her head slightly. You knew this would happen, didn't you? You've done this before. Harold smiled. Let's just say I've learned over the years that most people rise or fall to the expectations placed upon them. Downtown, they were expected to focus on high-value clients and prestigious accounts. At the community branches, they're expected to serve people, not just manage money. Well, it's working, Catherine confirmed. Their month of community service ends next week. The question is, what happens then? Harold considered this. That depends on them, doesn't it? People can change, Catherine, but the change has to come from within to be lasting. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. I have a proposal if you're interested. We've been discussing creating liaison positions between the downtown branch and our community locations. Someone who understands both worlds and can help ensure consistent service across the network. Blake and Melissa might be candidates for such roles, assuming their transformation is genuine. An excellent idea, Harold agreed. Draft a formal proposal and we'll discuss it at next week's executive meeting. After Catherine left, Harold returned to the Maritime Ventures documents, making notes for his upcoming conversation with Diana. He was careful not to cross the line between supporting his granddaughter and interfering in her case, but this information was too important to withhold. At the Westside branch, Blake was experiencing a breakthrough moment. A young entrepreneur named Darius had come in seeking a small business loan to expand his mobile car detailing service. Under normal procedures, Darius would likely be denied. His credit history had some blemishes from medical bills, and his business, while profitable, was still relatively new. 2 weeks ago, Blake would have mechanically applied the standard criteria and rejected the application. Today, he saw beyond the numbers to the person. Your current revenue is impressive for a one-man operation, Blake noted, reviewing the documentation Darius had provided. And your customer retention rate suggests you're providing excellent service. Darius nodded eagerly. I've got more business than I can handle on my own. If I could get this loan, I could buy a second vehicle, hire my cousin who just got his detailing certification, and double my capacity. Blake could see the vision, the potential. He also recognized the passion and work ethic in the young man sitting across from him. Qualities no credit score could measure. The standard loan program might be a tough fit, Blake admitted. But let me tell you about our Community Enterprise Initiative. It's designed specifically for growing local businesses like yours. As Blake explained the alternative program, which offered more flexible terms and considered factors beyond credit scores, he felt a genuine satisfaction that had been missing from his work downtown. He wasn't just processing an application, he was helping build someone's dream. After working out a preliminary plan with Darius, Blake approached Evelyn Carter's office. Got a minute? He asked, knocking lightly on her open door. Evelyn looked up from her computer. What's up, Blake? I've been working with Darius Williams on a small business application under the CEI program. His numbers are solid, but I wanted your input before we proceed. You know the community better than I do. Evelyn's expression shifted from professional interest to something warmer. Darius? His grandmother Elaine used to watch my kids after school. That boy has been hustling since he was 12. Had a car washing business in the neighborhood before he could even drive. Blake smiled. That's exactly the kind of information that doesn't show up in a credit report. So you think he's a good risk? I think he's a good investment, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. Bring me his file, and we'll review it together. As they worked through Darius's application, Blake realized he was learning a different kind of banking, one based on relationships and community knowledge rather than just algorithms and policies. It was messier, more complex, but also more meaningful. At the East Point branch, Melissa was having a similar epiphany as she helped an elderly couple navigate the complicated process of avoiding foreclosure on their home of 40 years. Mr. and Mrs. Gonzalez had fallen behind on payments after Mr. Gonzalez's hospitalization, and their mortgage servicer had been unhelpful at best, predatory at worst. "They kept adding fees we didn't understand," Mrs. Gonzalez explained tearfully in halting English. "Every month the amount grew, even when we made payments." Carmen translated the more technical aspects as Melissa reviewed their mortgage statements, quickly identifying several questionable charges and calculation errors. The servicer had been applying payments to fees first, rather than principal and interest, creating a snowball effect that pushed the couple further into delinquency with each passing month. "This isn't right," Melissa said, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine indignation. "They're taking advantage of you." Using her knowledge of banking regulations and consumer protection laws, knowledge she had previously employed primarily to ensure the bank's compliance rather than to advocate for customers, Melissa drafted a detailed letter contesting the improper fees and demanding a correct accounting of the Gonzalez's payments. "I'll help you through this," she promised the couple. "We'll fix this together." As she worked with Carmen to develop a sustainable repayment plan for the Gonzalezes, Melissa felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her career. Downtown, success meant meeting quotas and maximizing revenue. Here, success meant keeping a family in their home, preserving the dignity they had earned through decades of hard work. That afternoon, Diana Jenkins sat in her office, staring at the documents her grandfather had sent over regarding Maritime Ventures LLC. The implications were significant for the Thompson case and potentially for the entire community. If Eastern Horizon Group was behind Platinum's aggressive development plans, this wasn't just about one building or one family. It was about systematic displacement of residents across multiple neighborhoods, creating luxury enclaves inaccessible to the very people who had built and sustained those communities for generations. Diana picked up her phone and called Samuel Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I have some new information about your case. Could you and Mrs. Thompson come to my office tomorrow morning? There's something important we need to discuss." Samuel's voice was hesitant. "Is it bad news?" Lydia's been so stressed, her blood pressure. "Actually," Diana reassured him, "I think this might strengthen our position. But I need to explain it in person." After scheduling the meeting, Diana turned her attention to preparing for court. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and while she had originally planned to focus narrowly on the Thompsons' lease rights, this new information suggested a broader strategy might be more effective. If she could demonstrate that Platinum's development was part of a larger pattern of displacement backed by foreign investors with a history of exploitative practices, it might attract the attention of regulatory agencies and community advocates. The court of public opinion could be as powerful as the court of law in cases like this. Across town, Lawrence Morgan was growing increasingly frustrated. His contacts at the building department had informed him that someone was asking questions about all of Platinum's current projects, requesting inspection records and permit documentation that was technically public but rarely scrutinized. Simultaneously, several of his pending loan applications at other financial institutions had been placed under review without explanation, creating potential cash flow issues that could delay construction timelines. The delays were manageable for now, but if his Eastern Horizon investors caught wind of potential problems, they might reconsider their commitment. Morgan strongly suspected Harold Jenkins was behind these developments, but he couldn't prove it. The old man was too smart, too experienced to leave obvious fingerprints. It was infuriating. Jenkins acted like some kind of moral guardian, while simultaneously using his influence to undermine a legitimate business enterprise. Picking up his phone, Morgan called his attorney. "David, I need you to file a motion to expedite the Thompson case and start looking for any leverage we might have against Bradford, Wells, and Schmidt. Conflicts of interest, past ethical complaints, anything that might give Diana Jenkins second thoughts about pursuing this case aggressively." The attorney's response was hesitant. "Lawrence, we need to be careful here. Judge Watkins already denied our previous motion to expedite, and targeting opposing counsel could backfire badly." Morgan's fist tightened around his pen. "I'm not paying you for caution, David. I'm paying you for results. Make it happen." After ending the call, Morgan stared out his office window at the city skyline. He had worked too hard, come too far to let an old man in shabby clothes derail his most ambitious project yet. One way or another, the Riverside development would proceed as planned, and neither the Thompsons nor the Jenkins family would stand in his way. Sunday afternoon came again, bringing the Jenkins family together for their weekly dinner. This time, however, the atmosphere was charged with an energy that hadn't been present the week before. Diana arrived early to speak privately with Harold about developments in the Thompson case. Michael brought updated plans for the community center, proudly showing how they had incorporated Harold's suggestions from their previous conversation. Even the younger generation seemed more engaged than usual. Michael's teenage sons, normally glued to their phones, asked thoughtful questions about their great-grandfather's early business ventures, inspired by a school project on family history. As they gathered around the dining table, Harold looked at the faces of his family. His son Michael, steady and principled; his daughter-in-law Sarah, kind and insightful; his grandsons David and Marcus, finding their way in the world; and Diana, fierce and brilliant. They were his legacy, far more valuable than any building he had constructed or bank he had acquired. "Before we eat," Harold said, raising his glass, "I'd like to propose a toast to family, those who are here and those who are with us in spirit." His eyes briefly lingered on Margaret's empty chair, still set at the table as it had been every Sunday since her passing. "To family," they echoed, glasses raised. As they enjoyed Rosita's excellent cooking, the conversation flowed naturally between personal updates, community news, and increasingly, the situation with Platinum Properties. What had begun as Diana's case had evolved into a family concern, a challenge to the values the Jenkins family had always stood for: community, fairness, and the belief that progress should lift people up, not push them out. "So what's the next step?" Michael asked as they moved to the living room for coffee and Diana's homemade strawberry cake. "If these foreign investors are really behind Morgan's aggressive tactics, how do we fight that?" Diana looked at her grandfather, who nodded encouragingly. "We make it public," she said. "Not just the Thompson case, but the entire pattern. The community has a right to know who's really buying up their neighborhoods and what the long-term plan is." "It's risky," Harold acknowledged. "Morgan won't take this lying down, and these foreign investors have deep pockets." "Since when have Jenkins been afraid of a fight?" Diana asked with a smile that reminded Harold so much of Margaret it made his heart ache. "Besides, we have something they don't." "What's that?" Michael's son David asked curiously. Harold answered for Diana. "The truth, son. And sometimes that's the most powerful weapon of all." The preliminary hearing for the Thompson case was scheduled for Monday morning at the county courthouse. Diana arrived early, meticulous in her preparation as always. She had spent the weekend organizing her arguments, anticipating Morgan's legal team's tactics, and preparing Samuel and Lydia Thompson for what to expect. The Thompsons arrived shortly after her, dressed in their Sunday best, Samuel in a carefully pressed suit that had been tailored decades ago, Lydia in a modest floral dress and her favorite pearl earrings. Despite their obvious nervousness, they carried themselves with quiet dignity. "You look ready for battle," Diana greeted them with a reassuring smile. "My daddy always said dress for the life you want, not the one you have," Samuel replied, adjusting his tie. "Figure a man fighting for his home should look like he deserves to keep it." The simple wisdom in his words struck Diana deeply. It reminded her of her grandfather's philosophy, that appearance wasn't about vanity, but about respect, both for oneself and for the occasion. "Mr. Jenkins," Lydia suddenly exclaimed, looking past Diana toward the courthouse entrance. Diana turned to see her grandfather walking toward them, dressed not in his usual work clothes, but in a perfectly tailored suit that he normally reserved for board meetings and special family events. The transformation was striking, not because the clothes changed who he was, but because they revealed another facet of a man who moved comfortably between worlds. "Grandpa," Diana said, surprised, "I didn't expect you to come." Harold embraced her warmly. "Just here for moral support. This is your show, counselor." He turned to the Thompsons, greeting them like old friends. "Samuel, Lydia, it's been too long." "You know each other?" Diana asked, surprised once again. Samuel nodded. "Mr. Jenkins built the apartment complex across from ours back in '85. Used to come by the shop for alterations. Best-dressed construction boss in the city, once he was cleaned up." Harold chuckled. "Samuel's the only tailor who ever understood that I need extra room in the shoulders, but a trimmer waist. Made me look 10 pounds lighter in every suit." Diana watched the easy rapport between her grandfather and the Thompsons, realizing there were still layers to Harold Jenkins that she had yet to fully discover. His network of relationships, built over decades of fair dealing and mutual respect, extended far beyond business connections to form a complex web of community ties. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lawrence Morgan and his legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits carrying premium leather briefcases and exuding confidence. Morgan spotted Harold immediately, his expression hardening. "Jenkins," he acknowledged coldly, "I wasn't aware you had a personal interest in this minor landlord-tenant dispute." Harold's smile never wavered. "Just supporting my granddaughter Morgan and greeting old friends." Morgan's gaze shifted to the Thompsons, dismissing them with a brief glance before returning to Harold. "You're wasting your time and theirs. This case has only one possible outcome." "Perhaps," Harold replied evenly. "But I've found that in life, as in business, certainty is often the precursor to surprise." Before Morgan could respond, the courthouse doors opened, and they were called to proceed inside. Diana squeezed her grandfather's hand gratefully before leading the Thompsons toward the courtroom, her posture confident and determined. Harold watched them go, then took a seat on a bench in the corridor. He hadn't come just for moral support, though that was certainly part of it. He wanted to observe Morgan directly, to gauge his reaction to the arguments Diana planned to present. Sometimes the most revealing information came not from what people said, but from how they responded when caught off guard. Meanwhile, at the West Side branch, Blake was starting his final week with mixed emotions. What had begun as a humiliating punishment had evolved into an unexpected journey of professional and personal growth. He had come to appreciate the rhythm of the community branch, the relationships with regular customers, and most surprisingly, the satisfaction of making a tangible difference in people's financial lives. "Got a minute?" Evelyn Carter asked, appearing at his teller window during a quiet moment. "Of course," Blake replied, logging out of his terminal. Evelyn led him to her office, closing the door for privacy. "I've been asked to provide a final assessment of your time here," she said, getting straight to the point as was her style. "Before I submit it, I wanted to ask you a question." Blake nodded, curious. "What have you learned during your time at Westside?" The question was simple but profound. Blake considered it carefully, wanting to give an honest answer rather than just what he thought Evelyn wanted to hear. "I've learned that banking isn't just about numbers," he said finally. "Downtown, I saw customers as accounts, opportunities or obstacles. Here, I've seen them as people with stories, needs, and potential. I've learned that sometimes the most valuable service we provide isn't a complex financial product, but simply listening and understanding what someone really needs." Evelyn studied him, her expression unreadable. "And if you were to return downtown, would these lessons go with you, or would you revert to seeing people as walking bank accounts?" It was a fair question, one Blake had been asking himself. "I'd like to think I've changed," he said. "But honestly, environments shape behavior. If I went back to the same setting, with the same incentives and expectations, I don't know." His candor seemed to please Evelyn more than a confident assertion would have. "Well, that's a more self-aware answer than I expected. I'll include it in my report." As Blake stood to leave, Evelyn added, "By the way, Darius Williams' loan was approved this morning. Thought you'd want to know." The news brought a genuine smile to Blake's face. "That's great. I'll call him right away." At the East Point branch, Melissa was experiencing a similar moment of reflection as Louisa conducted her final assessment. "The Gonzalez case was impressive," Louisa noted, reviewing Melissa's work over the past month. "You didn't just help them with their immediate problem, you set up a system to prevent it from happening again. That kind of thorough solution is rare." Melissa shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It was the right thing to do. Their servicer was taking advantage of their limited English and understanding of financial terms. "And the financial literacy workshops? Carmen tells me you've created bilingual materials for the next session." "Just some basic translation cards," Melissa said modestly. "I noticed many participants were struggling to follow along, even with Carmen translating. This way they can see the terms in both languages." Louisa nodded, making notes. "Any thoughts on returning to downtown next week?" The question prompted a moment of honest introspection. "I'm not sure I want to," Melissa admitted. "The work here feels more meaningful. I know that probably sounds naive." "Not at all," Louisa interrupted. "It sounds like someone who's found her purpose." Back at the courthouse, the preliminary hearing was well underway. Morgan's legal team had presented their case first, a straightforward argument based on property rights, contract law, and the technical legality of their notices and offers to the tenants. Now it was Diana's turn. She approached the podium with calm confidence, nodding respectfully to Judge Watkins before beginning her presentation. "Your Honor, this case is about more than a lease dispute or relocation compensation. It represents a systematic pattern of community displacement carried out under the guise of urban renewal." She proceeded to outline not just the Thompsons' specific situation, but the broader context of Platinum Properties' activities across multiple neighborhoods. Using the information Harold and Robert Chen had uncovered, she explained the connection to Maritime Ventures LLC and ultimately to Eastern Horizon Group. This development is not, as the plaintiffs have claimed, about revitalizing a struggling neighborhood. It is part of a global strategy to acquire undervalued properties, displace long-term residents, and create luxury enclaves for maximum profit extraction. Morgan's attorneys objected repeatedly, arguing that the foreign investment structure was irrelevant to the specific lease dispute, but Judge Watkins allowed Diana to continue, his interest clearly piqued by the broader implications. "Your Honor, we ask the court to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. The Thompsons have lived in and contributed to this community for over 20 years. Their small business has served thousands of residents. Their roots run deep. To sever those connections based on technically legal but ethically questionable procedures would be a miscarriage of justice." As Diana concluded her arguments, Harold observed Morgan from his seat in the gallery. The developer's composed facade had cracked slightly during Diana's presentation, especially when she mentioned Eastern Horizon Group. That reaction confirmed Harold's suspicion that Morgan's foreign investors were a sensitive point. Perhaps they had conditions or expectations that Morgan was struggling to meet. Judge Watkins considered both presentations carefully before issuing his ruling. While I find merit in both arguments presented today, I am compelled by Ms. Jenkins's broader context regarding the development pattern. I am therefore issuing a temporary injunction preventing any eviction or demolition activities related to the Thompson property until a full hearing can be conducted. He fixed Morgan's legal team with a stern look. Additionally, I am requesting full disclosure of all ownership and investment structures related to this development project within 30 days. This court has an interest in understanding precisely who is driving changes to our communities and their long-term intentions. Morgan's expression darkened as the ruling was announced. His lead attorney immediately began whispering urgently in his ear, but Morgan brushed him off, his gaze fixed on Harold in the gallery. The look contained equal measures of fury and grudging respect, acknowledgement that the old man had outmaneuvered him once again. Outside the courtroom, the Thompsons embraced Diana tearfully. "It's just a temporary measure," Diana cautioned, not wanting to give false hope. "We still have the full hearing ahead of us." "But it gives us time," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Time to fight. Time to organize the neighbors. That's all we needed." Harold approached, offering congratulations to Diana with obvious pride. "Excellent work, counselor. Your grandmother would have been proud." As the Thompsons departed, Morgan emerged from the courtroom, dismissing his legal team with a curt nod before approaching Harold and Diana. "Impressive performance," he said, his tone deceptively casual. Bringing in the foreign investment angle was clever. Judge Watkins has always been a populist at heart. Diana stood her ground. "It wasn't a tactic, Mr. Morgan. It was the truth, something you might consider trying occasionally." Morgan's smile tightened. "The truth is subjective, Ms. Jenkins. From where I stand, I'm bringing needed investment to neglected areas. From where you stand, I'm disrupting communities. Both can be true simultaneously." "Not when you're deliberately concealing your investors' identities and their track record in other communities," Diana countered. Morgan turned his attention to Harold. "You're behind this, aren't you? The sudden interest in maritime ventures, the delays with my other financing applications. You're fighting me on multiple fronts." Harold's expression remained placid. "I'm just a concerned citizen watching out for my community, Morgan. Same as I've always been." "This isn't over," Morgan said, his voice low. "Eastern Horizon doesn't abandon projects, and neither do I. One court ruling won't change that." "Perhaps not," Harold agreed. "But it might give people time to ask the right questions, and in my experience, the right questions often lead to surprising answers." As Morgan walked away, Diana turned to her grandfather. "He seems rattled, more than a preliminary injunction would warrant." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Morgan's operating on tight margins with these developments, financially and politically. Delays cost money, and money is time when you have investors expecting returns. The question is, how far is he willing to go when backed into a corner?" The answer came sooner than either of them expected. Later that afternoon, as Harold was reviewing documents in his office, Catherine Yates rushed in without knocking, something she had never done before. "Mr. Jenkins," she said urgently, "there's something you need to see." She placed a tablet in front of him, displaying the website of the city's largest business publication. The headline made his blood run cold. "Jenkins Banking Empire Under Investigation. Sources claim First Capital Trust engaged in discriminatory lending practices." The article quoted anonymous whistleblowers, alleging that Harold had directed his bank to favor certain neighborhoods and demographics while deliberately limiting services to others. The claims were vague but damaging, designed to undermine his reputation and the bank's standing in the community. "It's Morgan," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger he felt rising within him. "This has his fingerprints all over it." Catherine nodded grimly. "That's my guess too. The timing is too convenient. We've already received calls from 2 major clients concerned about the allegations." Harold leaned back in his chair, thinking quickly. "Contact our legal team and prepare a statement refuting these claims in the strongest possible terms. Then call Marcus Reynolds and tell him to pull the community impact reports for the last 5 years, lending statistics by neighborhood, small business loans by owner demographics, everything that shows our actual practices." As Catherine hurried to carry out his instructions, Harold picked up his phone to call Diana. This attack wasn't just against him or the bank. It was against everything they had built together as a family, everything they stood for in the community. Morgan had escalated from business tactics to personal attacks, and Harold knew from long experience that men who fought this way were at their most dangerous when they felt cornered. The coming days would test not just his business acumen but his commitment to the principles that had guided him throughout his life. Would he respond to Morgan's underhanded tactics in kind, or would he find a way to fight that remained true to his values? It was a question Harold had faced many times in his long career, and his answer had always defined not just the outcome of the battle, but the man he saw in the mirror each morning. The next morning, Harold arrived at First Capital Trust headquarters, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his car dropping him at the main entrance rather than his usual side door. As he walked through the lobby, employees and customers alike turned to stare, partly because of the damaging articles circulating in the business press, but mostly because few had ever seen Harold Jenkins embrace the full mantle of his position so visibly. The message was clear. Today was not a day for understatement. Blake and Melissa, who had been summoned from their community branches for an emergency meeting, were waiting nervously near the executive elevators. They exchanged confused glances as Harold approached. "Mr. Jenkins," Melissa began hesitantly, "we saw the article. It's completely false. Anyone who's worked at the community branches knows that." Harold nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Ms. Winters. I suspect that's why you're both here today." Blake stepped forward. "Sir, I want to apologize again for how we treated you that first day. If there's anything we can do to help counter these allegations." "There is," Harold replied, gesturing for them to join him in the elevator. "That's precisely why I've called you back." In the executive conference room, Catherine Yates and Marcus Reynolds were already waiting, along with the bank's legal team and public relations director. Diana arrived moments later, looking composed but determined. "Let's get started," Harold said, taking his place at the head of the table. "By now, everyone has seen the accusations against First Capital Trust. They're false, but that hardly matters in the court of public opinion. What matters is our response." The PR director, a polished woman named Jennifer, spoke up. "We've prepared a statement categorically denying the allegations and highlighting our community investment programs. We're also reaching out to friendly journalists to counter the narrative." Harold shook his head slightly. "Standard corporate defense. It won't be enough. People are rightfully suspicious of institutions. They need to hear from real people with real experiences." He turned to Blake and Melissa. "That's where you come in. You've both spent the past month in our community branches, seeing firsthand how we actually operate. You've worked with the customers these articles claim we discriminate against, and perhaps most importantly, you had no particular loyalty to me or this institution when you began." Blake and Melissa exchanged surprised glances as Harold continued. "I'm proposing a press conference this afternoon. Not with me or our executives, but with you two, alongside community members you've worked with. People like Darius Williams and the Gonzalez family. Real people telling real stories about their experiences with First Capital Trust." The legal director frowned. Mr. Jenkins, with all due respect, putting junior employees front and center during a PR crisis is unorthodox. There are significant risks. There are always risks, Harold interrupted gently. But authenticity can't be manufactured, and that's what we need right now. Blake and Melissa have seen both sides of our operation. Their perspectives carry weight precisely because they weren't always believers. Diana, who had been listening thoughtfully, added, "And while that's happening, I'll be filing a defamation suit against the publication and seeking an emergency hearing to demand they reveal their sources. We have reason to believe Morgan orchestrated this as retaliation for yesterday's court ruling." Harold nodded approval. "Catherine, I need you to contact the branch managers at all our community locations. Ask them to reach out to customers who might be willing to speak about their experiences with the bank. Marcus, work with our data team to compile our lending statistics by neighborhood and demographic. Complete transparency." As the meeting continued, plans taking shape with remarkable speed, Blake found himself volunteering ideas based on his experiences at Westside. Ray Carter at the barbershop, he could be perfect for this. He's respected in the community, and he just adjusted his merchant services through us. And Jamal knows dozens of customers with powerful stories. Melissa similarly offered connections from East Point, the Gonzalez family, Mrs. Diaz, participants from the financial literacy workshops. Her knowledge of the community and its needs reflected a transformation that went far beyond professional development. By the time the meeting concluded, Harold felt a quiet confidence. Morgan had underestimated not just him, but the entire ecosystem of relationships and Trust First Capital Trust had built over decades. No hastily planted news story could undo that foundation. As the others filed out to execute their assignments, Harold asked Blake and Melissa to remain behind. "You've both exceeded my expectations," he told them frankly. "When I sent you to the community branches, I hoped you would learn something about banking differently. It seems you've learned something about yourselves as well." Blake nodded, his usual polished demeanor replaced by something more genuine. "I have, sir. I've been thinking a lot about what happens after this month. The truth is, I don't want to go back to what I was doing before." "Nor do I," Melissa added. "Working at East Point has changed how I see banking, what it can be at its best." Harold smiled, pleased but not surprised. "Catherine has been developing a proposal for liaison positions between downtown and our community branches. The roles would require understanding both worlds and helping us maintain consistent values across the network. I think you'd both be excellent candidates." Their expressions of surprise and gratitude confirmed what Harold had come to believe, that their transformation was genuine, not merely a temporary adaptation to their circumstances. "Think about it," he said. "We'll discuss details after we've handled the current situation." Across town, Lawrence Morgan was experiencing a very different kind of mourning. The preliminary injunction against the Thompson property had created a cascade of problems. Eastern Horizon's representatives were demanding explanations for the delay, threatening to withdraw their financing if the situation wasn't resolved quickly. Meanwhile, 3 other property owners in the development zone, emboldened by the Thompsons' temporary victory, had filed similar legal challenges. Morgan had expected his planted story about First Capital Trust to create enough distraction to buy him time, but he hadn't anticipated the speed and coordination of Harold's response. Within hours of the article's publication, community leaders were already publicly questioning its claims, citing personal experiences that contradicted the allegations. His office door opened without a knock, and his assistant entered looking pale. "Mr. Morgan, there's a Mr. Chen here to see you. He says you'll want to hear what he has to say." Morgan frowned. "Chen? I don't have any appointments with—" Robert Chen walked in before Morgan could finish, nodding dismissively to the assistant, who quickly retreated. "Mr. Morgan," Robert said, his voice carrying the calm authority of his 77 years. "I believe we should talk." Morgan studied the elderly man with growing unease. "And you are?" "Robert Chen, Harold Jenkins' friend and financial advisor for 40 years. He placed a folder on Morgan's desk. "Also, as it happens, an old acquaintance of Zhao Wei, the chairman of Eastern Horizon Group." Morgan's face remained composed, but his hand tightened imperceptibly on his pen. "I see. And the purpose of this visit?" Robert opened the folder, revealing a detailed analysis of Platinum Properties' financial structure, including the complex web connecting it to Maritime Ventures and Eastern Horizon. "To deliver a message. First, that Mr. Jenkins is fully aware of your company's precarious financial position. Second, that I've shared my concerns about certain irregular financing arrangements with my old friend Chairman Zhao." He smiled slightly at Morgan's carefully controlled reaction. "The Chinese business community is smaller than you might think, especially among those of my generation. Chairman Zhao values his reputation greatly. He was disturbed to learn how his company's investment was being represented here." Morgan leaned back, calculating his options. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Chen?" "A resolution," Robert replied simply. "One that allows Eastern Horizon to proceed with a modified development while respecting existing community members like the Thompsons. One that ends the media attacks on First Capital Trust immediately." He closed the folder. "Chairman Zhao has authorized me to inform you that Eastern Horizon is prepared to continue their investment under these new terms, or to withdraw completely and pursue other opportunities. The choice is yours." Morgan recognized the elegance of the trap Harold had set. By reaching out directly to Eastern Horizon through Robert Chen, he had effectively gone over Morgan's head to his investors, the one leverage point Morgan couldn't afford to lose. "I'll need to consider these suggestions," Morgan said carefully. Robert nodded, rising to leave. "Of course. Chairman Zhao and Mr. Jenkins look forward to your response by this evening." Later that afternoon, the press conference at First Capital Trust's main branch defied all conventional crisis management protocols. Instead of executives in suits making careful statements, customers from across the community spoke passionately about their experiences with the bank. Ray Carter described how Blake had helped him reduce his merchant services fees. The Gonzalez family, with Melissa translating, explained how she had saved their home from foreclosure. Blake and Melissa themselves spoke candidly about their initial impressions of the bank's downtown operations versus what they had witnessed in the community branches. Their honesty about their own learning curve lent credibility to their defense of the institution. "I used to think banking was about numbers on a spreadsheet," Blake admitted to the assembled reporters. "But at Westside, I learned it's about people like Darius Williams who just needed someone to look beyond his credit score to see his potential." Melissa followed with similar candor. "The allegations in yesterday's article don't match anything I've seen at East Point. In fact, I've witnessed the exact opposite, a commitment to serving everyone in the community, especially those who might be overlooked by other institutions." From the back of the room, Harold watched with quiet satisfaction. He had built First Capital Trust on relationships and trust, and those foundations were proving stronger than Morgan's underhanded tactics. By evening, news outlets were already shifting their coverage, questioning the anonymous sources in the original article and highlighting the community response. Meanwhile, Diana's legal team had secured an emergency hearing for the following morning to address the defamation claims. Harold was in his home office reviewing the day's developments when his phone rang. It was Robert Chen. "It's done," Robert said without preamble. "Morgan has agreed to the terms. Eastern Horizon will proceed with a modified development plan that preserves the Thompsons building and several other historic properties. The media attacks will cease immediately, with a retraction published tomorrow citing reporting errors." Harold smiled, grateful for his old friend's assistance. "Thank you, Robert, and please convey my appreciation to Chairman Zhao for his reasonable approach." "He sends his regards," Robert replied, "and suggests perhaps a direct meeting when he visits next month. He says he admires your method of conducting business." After ending the call, Harold sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the events of recent weeks. Morgan had underestimated him from the beginning, seeing only an old man in simple clothes rather than recognizing the experience and relationships built over a lifetime. It was the same mistake Blake and Melissa had made that first day in the bank, judging by appearance rather than substance. The following Sunday brought the Jenkins family together again for their weekly dinner. This time, the atmosphere was celebratory. The Thompson case had been settled favorably, with Platinum Properties agreeing to preserve their building and offering a long-term lease at stable rates. Diana had received recognition for her legal strategy, bringing attention to the broader issue of development without displacement. Blake and Melissa had accepted the liaison positions, beginning what promised to be a significant shift in how First Capital Trust operated across all its branches. The false allegations had been retracted, with the business publication issuing a formal apology. As they gathered around the table, Harold looked at his family with profound gratitude. These battles were becoming theirs to fight, their values carrying forward into a new generation. "A toast," Michael proposed, raising his glass. "To Dad, who taught us all that clothes don't make the man, principles do." "To Harold," the others echoed. Harold shook his head slightly, smiling. "No, to all of us. To seeing people for who they are, not what they appear to be. And to remembering that the true measure of success isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute." As the evening continued with laughter and conversation, Harold felt Margaret's presence strongly, as if she were sitting in her usual place, nodding approval at how their shared vision had taken root and flourished. Outside, the sun set over the neighborhood he had helped revitalize decades ago, casting long shadows across streets where children played safely and families built their futures. This, more than any bank building or balance sheet, was Harold Jenkins's true legacy. Communities where people of all backgrounds could thrive with dignity and hope. It was worth more than all the designer suits in the world.